There have been many famous wizards in the world who have written their names into history. They left behind a rich legacy of their theories and accumulated experience. Even those who did not follow the path of the magician were interested in them. These were great men who raised the status of the empire with their appearance for thousands of years. Their works are in the Imperial Library. People from all over the world wanted to come here and gain the knowledge of these heroes, but not everyone admired them so much. Some people did not consider them heroes and sages at all, but only untalented people and fools, and were not embarrassed to say so. After all, he spent decades of effort to elevate these people to the rank of archmages. His story began like all great and not so great heroes. A heavy truck sent him to the other side of the river Styx by express delivery. As is expected according to canon, he was reborn in another world, but became a book, a grimoire containing all the wisdom of magic. At first it confused him as to what kind of story the book could have, but then he found something to do in this world: raising wizards. Raising a wizard is not difficult, because you just need to open a book to get all the knowledge. And having received them, the hero went to fight the monsters, confident in his strength. Basic magic was very easy to learn and use, just like breathing, and a fireball would fly from your fingers. The monsters turned to ashes, and the pleased student asked the grimoire if he had done a good job. But the advanced textbook of magic slapped the careless student in the face, regretting that he had not been reborn into a thicker Talmud. The book scolded the student for allowing magic to flow in this way. Be that as it may, the theory and practice were written on the pages of his new body, and he continued to teach. Knowledge was his instinct, so he constantly scolded his students if they did not understand anything. After nurturing disciples for 1,000 years, the grimoire finally found peace, but now it was in this place. After all, every time the owner of the grimoire dies, he must start all over again. But for the last 300 years, it has been lying in this library. Civilization flourished. There were so many books that he simply got lost among them. Even being the smartest book of magic, he fell into despair. The grimoire was yearning for someone to read it, and so a young man came along and wandered into this remote section in search of books. The grimoire begged to read this. He did not even hope that the boy would hear his voice, because only those who touched him could hear it. But then his hand accidentally slid along the spine of a strange book with a black cover, and the student thought he heard something. Grimoire controlled his voice as best he could and spoke to the guy. He asked to open the book faster. The student was surprised that the book could talk, but curiosity got the better of him, and he opened the grimoire, which immediately became illuminated by a magical light. In a confident voice, the grimoire showed him how it could make him a great wizard, starting from the lowest rank. The boy fell to the floor from the unexpected performance, and the grimoire promised to give him everything it showed if he joined it. The book promised that with its help, all the boy's magical talents would blossom, and he would go down in history as a great archmage. Of course, all this was a beautiful screen. At the first touch, it was clear that the boy did not have any talents, but he could still become an archmage. But the student turned out to be not so simple. Despite the fact that his eyes initially lit up with interest, he did not really want to become an archmage. The dialogue did not go according to the template, and Grimm was confused. He again stated that only he could make the guy an archmage. But the boy answered confidently that he still didn't want to, because his dream was to become a knight. Then the grimoire went all out and said that the guy wielded magic better than a sword, and to his surprise, replied that he had been watching him. He has been watching him for a long time and knows for sure that the guy is a natural-born swordsman, since he can use both. The student liked the idea. It sounded cool, and images from cheap novels came to mind. All that was needed was to open it, and then it would make him a legendary swordsman, Grimm stated. Finally, he thought, as the boy opened the book and magical light poured out. A magical seal appeared before him. It established a connection between the teacher and the student. There were only two of them, until death. As soon as the contract was concluded, Grimm immediately exclaimed joyfully, discarding his calm and mysterious tone of a sage. He was glad to get away from this book-filled place where Grimm felt uneasy. But then the bespectacled man said that he had thought about it, and did not want to be a magician, because he was from a family of knights, and did not want to be kicked out of there. But now Grimm could press the boy, and indignantly asked what was the matter. He started yelling at him, asking if the young adventurer was really so afraid of his father, and that he would be punished for studying magic. He only needs to learn magic, and he will become 10 times stronger than his father. It is enough to use one spell, Grimm shouted. But the boy did not appreciate the approach. He didn't want to attack his father, and suggested that Grimoire introduce another student to the academy and conclude a new contract with him. But Grimm answered no, of course. How could it be otherwise, after all? The contract is for life for the student. To make a new one, you have to wait until the guy dies. Grimm burst into a stream of abuse and disappointment. He waited 300 years for a student, and he got a scoundrel, in which case it would have been better not to sign the contract at all. The boy became embarrassed and said that he was sorry, but the loud book did not calm down. An apology was not enough, and he began to insult him. The boy shrank even more and could only apologize. But then the pride of a swordsman from a family of knights awoke in him, and he shouted back at the impudent book. "First they forced a contract on him, and now he's being insulted by some textbook," the student shouted. He abruptly returned the Talmud to its place among the equally faceless books, and said that since he had waited here for 3 centuries, he would wait a little longer. Grima shouted after him that he could not do this to him, but the student had already left, wishing to wait for his death. Then the angry Grimm used his power and told the boy to stop, but the ability didn't work as it should. He watched as his newly found hope left him, and in despair he shouted at the guy to just die, to hit himself against the wall. Unexpectedly for himself, the future knight slipped on a piece of paper. It is absolutely unclear how, but he died simply by falling to the floor, and thus the grim curse worked, and the apprentice's place became free again. The poor guy lay in the far section for another half day until he was found by a student who happened to be passing by. The body was carried away, and the library quickly fell silent, and Grimm began to wonder if he could get out of this place. It's a pity for the guy, he died young, but on the other hand, gathering dust on the shelf for another 100 years was unthinkable for Grimma. The owner has died, so it will soon be moved to a new habitat, perhaps to the office of a magnificent palace. He could have ended up in a stinking underpass or a bustling marketplace, but Grimm would have liked a better place. Suddenly he heard quiet steps approaching the door and wondered who had come at such a late hour. The man who entered broke the lock and did it quietly and quickly. He did it with a master key, a very unusual student of the academy, thought Grimm. No one would sneak into the library late at night for entertainment. The burglar wandered between the shelves and persistently searched for something. He walked around all the shelves in the back section and looked through every book. For a second, Grimm thought they were looking for him. But then it dawned on him that in a minute he would move to another place, and Grimm began desperately calling for the thief, who had already found what he was looking for. He asked so hard to read it that his words seemed to reach the thief, and he turned around. Succumbing to an intuitive insight, the thief jumped straight to the strange book that stood out from the rest. All he had to do was open it. 300 years have passed since he was sent to the Imperial Library, and he got lost here. But today he was already being held by the second student. When the thief opened the book, Grimma immediately made a contract with him. The student sat down on the floor and sighed wearily. The thief was tired from all the worries. She had come a long way here, and fortunately she had not been detected by the Academy's magical devices. And now, after she grabbed the book, the image of a young guy appeared in front of her. Grimm asked the little one what her name was. Now he needed to figure out who he got. The girl with straw-colored hair and egg yolk eyes introduced herself as Riley. Grimm was surprised that she only called them by them and asked her last name. But the girl had no other name, she replied. He leaned towards her and asked how she knew where he was and why she was in a hurry, as if she knew he would disappear today. Grimm's voice has found its owner. It is telepathy, which is possessed by those who contact it, or a creature sensitive to magic, like a dragon or a spirit. It is all the more surprising that a simple student of the Academy caught such a subtle wave. But Riley stunned him with her answer. She knew nothing about it. She simply heard a voice calling her and asking her to read. Then she wandered around the library, where they were chatting about a strange accident, and she became curious if she could escape from the Academy. Her explanation was just nonsense, but perhaps she was born with an affinity for mana, like a fairy or a magical beast, Grima thought. Among people, this was a great rarity. Sometimes there appeared those who possessed crazy talent and potential, and this girl could be one of those gifted ones, Grim dreamed. Then such a student will become the greatest of all those he has trained. That was enough information for now, and Grim touched her nose to introduce himself. He is a great grimoire who will make her an outstanding wizard. Later, Riley returned to the dorm. Her room had 5 beds, but everyone had gone home for the holidays, so she was here alone. Riley didn't leave because she had no family or home to return to. Grim thought, in this world even commoners had a last name. It was strange that the girl didn't have one. He asked her to tell him more about herself, because he needed to know his student better. Riley said that she used to have a hard time telling right from wrong and was a member of the Thieves' Guild, called the Second. And the boy who came before her was the first. For the guild, they were just tools. Back then, Riley simply did what the adults told her to do and carried out their instructions every day. The Thieves' Guild isn't the best place, she told Grimma. At some point, the adults' looks became strange, so Riley had to kill them so that they wouldn't threaten her. But that wasn't enough, so she eventually had to run away from the guild. Grimma continued for her. Apparently, she had simply encountered a high-ranking mage who recognized her talent and enrolled her in the academy. Grimma now understood how she managed to penetrate the guarded and locked library. At the academy, she also stood out and was a black sheep, which meant she was bullied, Grimm assumed, and Riley replied that only at first. Some guy from some clan helped her, and Grimm ignored these boring details. He extended his hand to her, said that he hoped they would get along, and promised to raise her to be a great wizard. Riley was also glad to meet him, but then someone started knocking on her door and demanding that she open it. They were her roommates, and Grimma asked Riley in surprise how come they hadn't moved away. Amid their screams, he asked her again if she was being bullied, and Grimm realized that the story about helping was a fabrication. 3 girls burst into the room screaming, and from their faces it was clear that they were furious. Riley lay on the street like a beaten dog, whining quietly. Grimm asked her how she was. If she had started a fight with these goddamn dandelions, she would have been expelled, since they were all from noble families, so Riley tolerated it. Grimm responded to this by saying that if she were to study at the academy, she would not have time to study with him. It will be difficult to learn magic if spoiled children are constantly interfering. Riley asked her new mentor what to do then, and he offered her 2 chairs. Either endure and learn magic from him, or drop out of the academy, Grimm suggested, and both were worse. Riley noted that the choice was not so great, but it was a choice that Grimm had told her harshly. A life of bullying but with a guaranteed future at the academy. Or uncertainty but freedom, Riley wondered. Grimma told her that the exit process took less than 3 minutes. Riley agreed. She only had to write an application and fill out paperwork. She also tried to check if it was true that only the owner of the book could see Grimm, and it turned out to be so. His main form was a book, and he took on the form of a human to communicate with the owner. Grimm understood that Riley would lose many of the privileges of the academy. Special artifacts for winning tournaments, or high-quality reagents that are given as a reward for academic success. Riley was surprised he brought it up now. He should have thought about it earlier. Grimma asked in response whether she already regretted dropping out of school, but that was not the point. Riley pointed in the direction and said that the academy's storage room was there, and Grimm didn't understand what she was planning. Riley thought that he wanted to steal artifacts and reagents. She spoke about it completely calmly. Her conscience did not bother her. He promised her that by combining her talent and his knowledge she would achieve success, but by staying at the academy, she would receive all these things. So this is not stealing at all, but simply a reward that she already deserves, said the shameless thief. Later they began to look for an emergency exit in the labyrinth of passages. They found themselves at a crossroads, and Grimm asked Riley if he knew the way. The girl did not. Then the wise mentor suggested that she learn one technique. It was a pathfinding spell, Grimm stated proudly, but Riley replied that she had already learned it at the academy. He offered to show her once, and Riley gathered a sparkling blue ball of mana in her hands. She cast the spell, and the flow of magic flowed from her fingers with surprising ease. There were 3 traps on the left side, and the right side ended in a dead end, and Grimma praised her for her execution. But he objected that her actions were too boring and ineffective. He told her not to obey the rules set by weak spirits and fools, because she was much above that, and suggested another method. There was no need to direct the mana in one direction. It was better to distribute it and disperse it, Grimma suggested, and Riley did so. But that was just the beginning. Grimma told her to focus and direct her attention to every magical particle. She had to track every drop of mana that rained down and then visualize them all. And then Riley saw. Their ship sailed peacefully on the calm waves, with full sails, the morning breeze driving their ship into the harbor. Grimma praised his student, who was clutching a pouch full of potions and useful things that they had grabbed from the academy. Grimm himself could not believe that 30 years later he could smell the sea salt on his pages. And yet he decided to clarify something. She risked her life to get it from the library. Now she dropped out of school to learn the art of magic from him. This was clearly not a spontaneous decision, so Grimma asked what her goal was. The stars fell upon the earth like a firestorm, with all the inevitability. The wooden city caught fire like a pile of oiled brushwood. The fire mages finished off the survivors by shooting them point blank. The boy dragged her along with him, and they ran away from the killers, who did not discriminate between their victims. He told her to run quickly, but he himself remained standing in the middle of a sea of fire. Riley thought about Grimma's question. Why did she really need it? The disturbing memories did not leave her even after all these years. The girl answered at length that she had a goal that she could achieve only if she became stronger. Grimm thought that usually those who thirst for power, through magic, seek one thing, revenge, he asked. Riley nodded silently. He wanted to ask her to whom and how, but he didn't. It was unpleasant to talk about such things, and not easy, Grimm understood. Moreover, her childhood is darker than dark, and it doesn't pass without a trace. Not even a day has passed since their meeting. Everything has its time. Riley asked him back what his purpose was, to train those he had contracted with like her. Grimm also immersed himself in his flashback. He had his own reasons for teaching the dummies magic. But in the end, he answered that there was no particular point. It was just fun. What else could he do? living in the form of a book. Now that Riley had been expelled from the academy and had received a letter of recommendation from the professor, she asked what they would do next. Grimma asked her to get the paper, and Riley obediently unfolded the letter. She read the letter of recommendation from the magic tower of Orontes, and Grimm wondered where it was anyway. After all, it had been on the shelf for 300 years. I would like to receive a letter of recommendation from one of the 5 greatest towers of the Empire. The magic tower is a place where mages can form bonds. One cannot become an archmage just by having skills. There was no better place to develop political status than a magic tower. But Grimm didn't know what kind of place it was, which he had never heard of. Riley noticed his thoughtfulness and said that Orontes was one of the main 5 towers. To learn more about it, you need to know about the owner and creator of the tower. Riley opened the book and showed an engraving of some smug old man. Grimm was surprised that they had brought in an image of a man shortly before his death, rather than a picture of his better days, and Riley countered that that was what they were. The old man in the painting was not that old. He was only 40 years old when the portrait was painted. Moreover, he was still alive, despite the fact that the portrait was painted 3 centuries ago. Grimma assumed that Orontes was a half-elf and contradicted himself because then he wouldn't look like that. However, even though he was only a high-ranking wizard, he was considered to have left behind the achievements of an archmage. The magical community was still debating whether to give him the title of Great Wizard, but he single-handedly raised the status of the tower. Grimma said to this that the information still gave them nothing. 3 centuries is like an eternity to someone stuck on a bookshelf. But this time was enough to change the magic towers themselves, because a lot happened that he did not know. Grimm read in the book that immortality was created by the sorceress Martha, Orontes' teacher, and one of the great magicians of the Empire during her lifetime. John Orontes achieved immortality, became an archmage who raised the status of the Empire, and fulfilled the wish of his teacher. They arrived at the capital of the Empire. Riley was here for the first time since leaving the Thieves' Guild. Grimma suggested that they take a look around the city since they were already here. First of all, Riley wanted to try the food she always denied herself. Unicorn shashlik, simply delicious. I will feel the rainbow inside me. The taste was completely different, because it was the meat of a divine beast. But Grimm objected that it was only a unicorn in name, and could not be distinguished. Riley was immediately shocked. She really thought there was a unicorn in there and wanted her money back already. While they were chatting casually, they came to a square where statues of the 5 great Hokage, or wizards, stood. 5 sages, geniuses extremely talented and passionate about magic, Riley said. But Grimm only chuckled sarcastically. They were all just dummies, he said. But he kindly noted that these guys were the kind of people who never give up. Grimm remembered her question again about what his purpose in raising wizards was. Raising ordinary people into great wizards is his revenge. Revenge on those who turned him into a pile of thick-bound pages. And his students worked very hard for this, Grimm smiled. Martha tried to create a resurrection ritual for him, but she failed. But as far as Grimm could remember, she had no students, which meant Jan Orontes was a liar, Riley suggested, and Grimma agreed. Showing her his fist, he suggested that Riley go to the tower. Grimm couldn't forgive the guy who pretended to be his student. Riley promised to take revenge on Ian Orontes for him, and in return, he must help take revenge on her. That day, in front of the statues of the great magicians, they made this promise, sealing it with blows of their fists. This is how their story began, in the very center of the capital. This happened to him 5 years after he turned into a grimoire. It was stolen from a rundown shop by a boy named Findel, who was barely making ends meet living in the slums. He decided to call him Grimm, despite attempts to explain that the correct word was grimoire. But the boy didn't like this difficult-to-pronounce word. He became the first owner and gave it this name, Grimma. He was confused then, for he had only recently become a book, and Findel had become like light. Grimm wanted to thank him for this. He began to teach the boy magic, right in the middle of the street. He put his palms out in front of him. Grimma said to wait, and soon a tickling sensation appeared. Then he ordered to direct this energy to the heart. Everything worked out, but the boy felt a little pain. Grimm asked him to hold on a little longer. The boy began to complain about the burning, and Grimm grumbled. He thought that knowledge was simply being transferred, but he told him to just continue. But Findal began to scream even louder. He was very hot, and he could no longer maintain control. Grimma shouted at him not to hurry because it was dangerous. But it was too late. The mana hit and the guy started to fall. He fell lifeless on a cold stone in the middle of a slum from which he never escaped. A carriage with a coachman was driving through the forest. It was not the most expensive vehicle, but it was completely inaccessible to commoners. Grimm rode in silence, looking out the window to get rid of the unpleasant memories. When Riley turned to him, she realized her mistake. The coachman knew that she was traveling alone and talking to herself would arouse unnecessary suspicion. Now that they had a connection, Grimm could add a little magic and amplify his voice, and they gained telepathy. Earlier he was talking about kebabs again, but suddenly she answered him with this skill. Grima shuddered in surprise and asked her not to do that again. It was quite a handy technique, and Riley asked him why he hadn't taught it to her before. But what he really enjoyed was watching her whisper sweetly to him. But Riley would definitely be angry if he said that. But then the girl realized that she could feel his true thoughts through the connection. Grima changed the subject. If the Tower of Arantes is one of 5, for admission you will need to pass a test, and this cannot be approached lightly. The towers need ready and proven masters. They do not take simple candidates, a selection place, the kingdom of meritocracy. In order for Riley to be accepted into the tower, she must defeat countless wizards and prove her powers. Naturally, wizards prepare for the test their entire lives. It's not for nothing that the test is called a graveyard for promising players. But they will take the test this year, Grima said. Riley was surprised that it was possible to grow to the point where it could compete with high-ranking wizards. It was simply impossible. But Grima assured her that it was possible with him, and she would pass this test in just 6 months of preparation. He had prepared something for her, Grim said and smiled mysteriously. When the coachman arrived at the appointed place, he asked Riley if she really was going there, since they were in the middle of the forest. Grima answered for Riley, saying that this was the right place and he could leave, and don't ask how it works. When the coachman left, Grima delighted the girl that this was the place where she would train and live for 6 months. And his former student also lives here. Riley was surprised, because he should be more than 3 centuries old. Grim answered mysteriously that he was neither alive nor dead. One of his careless students had turned into a lich, Grim said when they arrived at the cemetery. Only a great magician can become a lich. This student of his was an archmage in life. But there were only trees around, and Grima said that this was also a kind of test. Riley had to find it herself. People who can't pass it are not worthy of studying magic. But Riley already knew how to find the necessary things. The first point of training was to find the Lich's hideout in this forest. Riley used pathfinding spells, according to the method that Grim advised her. In this area, there were many spells that raised alarms, barriers, illusions, and magic that affected the senses. The girl with golden eyes was very proud when she heard Riley's voice. Not surprising, said the necromancer, since even a mid-ranking wizard would need half a year to find this refuge. He was outraged that a simple student decided that she would find him. It was no wonder that Riley was so proud of herself, since her affinity with magic was at the highest level. As soon as she found the necromancer, he himself appeared right in front of her, surrounded by a magical barrier. The Lich was completely confused and did not understand how she found him. But then he started coughing with a non-existent throat from excitement. When he finished, he could speak normally again. The Lich asked Grim how the girl found him, since it usually takes 2 years, but the record was 4 months. But for Riley, it took 10 minutes. She broke the magical power that was preventing her pathfinding from going through. This method was only available to people with superior mana sensitivity, so Lich assumed that she had tracked his spell. And Riley confirmed his guess. She's just a monster, the dead man declared. He led the guests to his hideout, which was guarded by various monsters. Looking at the strange menagerie, Grim thought that the former student was not changing his hobbies. Looking around this bestiary, it was hard to call it a refuge, and the skeleton only laughed. He brought the guests into his modest chambers and even poured them tea, but Riley looked at him with suspicion. Grima asked Lich to hide his energy because Riley was uncomfortable, having to constantly wrinkle his nose. The Lich betrayed the laws of heaven and was cursed by the gods, after which he could only accept the energy of black magic. Thus he defied death. Since he was already dead, Grim abandoned him here and began looking for a new student, and Riley now understood why. Black magic is prohibited in the Empire. God worshippers, black magicians, necromancers, the Thieves' Guild bought various things from them, and the Inquisition existed to punish them. Grima asked his apprentice how he was doing, and he replied that he had been sitting there for 2,000 years, ever since he became a Lich, so nothing had happened to him since. The Lich studied magic, curses, and occasionally met students of Grim, until 5 years ago he was invaded by a group of seekers. Grim was very surprised that ordinary travelers were able to invade this place. Because of the dark energy, they decided that this place was a dungeon and immediately attacked the Lich, so he had to fight, he said while pouring tea into the void. Grima asked what happened to the poor fellows, and the Lich replied that he had made them his slaves since he was short of hands. "They're right here," said the skeleton, pointing with his knuckles. Jeremy, his right-hand man, introduced the knight who poured the tea. The Death Knight screamed at Grim, even though the Lich said he was just an adventurer. There was no way a simple poor guy would become a Death Knight, and something seemed familiar to Riley. She recognized the golden sword and the lion crest that the Inquisition wore. Jeremy was the head of the order, and had disappeared after a raid 5 years ago. The search was ongoing. The Lich laughed sheepishly. He didn't know this. He just killed those who invaded his shelter. At first, dark magic affects the minds of the dead very little, Grimm thought. He used to visit him often to check on him, but over the course of 3 centuries he had loosened the reins considerably. The skeleton decided to change the subject and asked why Grimm had come here with his student. He replied that this child could learn a lot from the ancient bones, and she was capable. Lich agreed with this. The last student that Grimm brought was named Murata. Lich immediately remembered the girl with silver hair. They really did have something in common. Grimm told Lich about the impostor who pretended to be a follower of Martha, and that they wanted to take revenge on him by getting into his tower. The Lich wondered why he would go to Orontes' tower and get into trouble. It would have been easier to go to another tower and take control of it, like the 5 towers that Orontes had pushed back. Grimm agreed that this was a more rational path. But the most fun was destroying everything from the inside, Grimm said and smiled. Lich stated that his former teacher was strange, and he objected that it was not for a skeleton to say that. Then Lich asked Riley what she thought about it, because if she followed the teacher, she would be in danger. But they were on the same wavelength with Grimm. She also thought that it was a fun and exciting way. Then the Lich realized that they were 2 peas in a pod. Afterwards, Lich led them to the training ground, a special space that he had been creating for a very long time together with the teacher. Even for Riley, it would be hard to learn everything in 6 months. But what if they had 4 times as much time? Riley was delighted with the space they created. Grimm began to explain, and said that Riley had 2 advantages over other wizards. Thanks to her membership in the Thieves' Guild, she had nimble hands and an innate affinity with mana. From now on, they will focus on these 2 points and on 1 spell. Grimm showed her, and Riley immediately recognized the magic of destroying other spells, which did not require protection. Dispel, a simple anti-magic, was a useful skill when used skillfully. It allowed the flying fireballs to be turned into elemental particles of mana. Now Riley had to understand why Grimm had suggested training 1 spell. At the selection test, he suggested using Dispel to prevent opponents from using advanced magic, and then use Agility to engage the enemy in close combat. Grimm praised her for her correct guess. No matter what level the enemy is, you just need to block his flow of magic. Lich called it a disgrace. But for Riley, this was the only way to deal with the opponents in the trial, so Grimm asked for a favor. But then Riley was surprised that she was asked to use anti-magic without explaining anything. Lich asked if she had learned this at the academy. It was complex magic and wasn't taught until 3rd year, Riley replied, and Lich said it was even better that way. A couple of times is enough to learn, he said, and Riley felt a flow of magic. Grimm thought, after all the training they had done. He told Lich that the blows also increased skill, one way or another, looking at the thief spread out before him. However, he did not understand why her skill did not grow. The Lich fired a blast of green magic at her, and Riley met it bravely, but only at first. Then she indulged in a shameful flight. She ran away for an hour, and Grimm began to think that something was wrong with his teaching method. Only 3 days had passed since their meeting. He still didn't know much about her, but he understood that the girl had exorbitant ambitions, and also an aversion to failure. When she was in the Thieves' Guild, she couldn't bear to fail, and it seemed like she was under similar pressure now. She's definitely afraid of failure, Grimm thought, looking at Riley carefully. She noticed his gaze and looked back. For some reason, Riley instinctively ran away. But realizing what he was thinking, she countered that she simply didn't want to experience pain if magic hit her. It turned out that Riley didn't understand the method itself, Grimm understood. To recognize the enemy's spell, to get to the source, to delve into the technique, detailed steps are needed. But then he said that he had already told her everything that needed to be told, and she should think again. Just now she was panicking because of the fear of getting hurt, but now she could think calmly. They stood opposite each other, and the Lich released his magic at Riley again. The only thing Grimm taught her was pathfinding skills and telepathy. She didn't understand how to apply it. Riley didn't ask any more questions, and remembered Grimm's words at the academy, not to obey the rules of fools. Now she was ready to forge her own path. The magic chain of the spell was like a maze. Riley used pathfinding on it and saw a pattern in front of her. She had already passed through the labyrinths twice, at the academy and here in the forest. All that was left was to apply all the methods one by one. You need to act secretly, as if you were communicating with the skill of telepathy. When the magic wore off, Grimm congratulated Riley on his success. 4 hours passed while she stood there trying to solve this riddle. Riley estimated that in reality it had been an hour. But Grimm explained to her that while 4 hours had passed outside, Riley had actually been concentrating for 16 hours. As she fell to her knees, she was surprised at how quickly time had flown by. Grimm said that much more like this awaited her in the future. Riley breathed a sigh of relief. Now she was sure that she had figured it out completely. Grimm was glad to hear it if that was true. Time really did go by quickly, the seasons changed, and Riley continued training. She fought monsters from the Lich's bestiary and learned how to stop them. So time flew by quickly, and the time for selection tests arrived. After long and hard training, she managed to reverse the Lich's magic and spent 2 years here. Grimm was now confident that Riley could handle any mid-level mage. Lich praised her for her work and told Jeremy to cook a delicious dinner. Grimm praised the hospitable skeleton. He also showed himself to be a good fellow. Grimma said that they needed to work on the attack some more. But then Riley saw the leaf. They read its contents together. A plan for world domination. Step 1. Create a Death Knight. Step 2. Create a chimera that wields magic. Riley and Grimma looked reproachfully at the Lich, who had been lying to them all this time. While he was gone, the Lich tried to take over the world, Grimm realized, and became terribly angry. The Lich began to justify himself by saying that he did not want to conquer any world, only a small city nearby, and make it his kingdom. Grimm grabbed his head. This explanation made things even worse. Lich tried to put on a casual face and say that everything was fine. He hadn't caused any trouble. And while the Lich was thinking about his plan for conquest, snow lay in the north of the empire. It crunched merrily under the feet of the beauty with lilac-colored eyes, and behind her back someone was preparing their own plot. Despite this, she walked completely carefree without fearing anything. The attackers, sitting in the bushes, considered her to be a careless and weak prey. They jumped out of the bushes, shouting that it was dangerous to walk along this road alone. The villains were not going to leave the girl alive because the one holding the bow in his hands immediately released the bowstring. They saw an arrow pierce the girl's fragile body. When she fell into the snow, they began to search the contents of her pockets and found many valuable things there, things that could not be found in the dungeon. They were completely engrossed in studying the loot, but then one of the scoundrels called his boss. He replied with displeasure that he was busy, but the hanger-on insisted that he should take a look anyway. In the distance, on the white snow, stood the girl they had killed and smiled sweetly at them. At the same time, the robbers saw how the treasures and the body of the murdered woman disappeared, as if they had never been there. They immediately realized that there was a magician in front of them and froze with fear. The leader ordered them to raise their swords and said that they would definitely defeat her, because there were more of them. There was just a fragile girl in front of them, he thought, when the mages struck them. The leader saw his dead comrades and could no longer move, and the sorceress touched his face. She smiled at him again kindly and said that since they had crossed her path, they had to pay for it. Later, a carriage was driving along the same path. An old man with a cane climbed down to examine the bodies of the dead, and immediately understood what had happened. The bandits had met a magician. The battle, if you could call this massacre, that happened 5 hours ago, the old man said to tell the guards when to return to the city and to go on. He assured his fellow travelers that there would be no problems as long as he was there, and they believed him. When the old man took his seat in the stagecoach, he noticed a girl with a boyish haircut sitting opposite him. He turned to her and asked why she was going to Windhelm. Riley honestly admitted that she was going to take the 5 Great Towers selection exam. The old man warned her that she was going to certain death. All sorts of wizards flocked to the selections, and many different tragedies happen. There are some real lunatics out there who think exams are a legal place to kill. She should have the skills to protect herself. It was commendable that she had already reached her level at such a young age, but the selection test was more than one could imagine, the old man warned. Riley thanked him for his sincere advice, but had already made up her mind. The old man nodded in disappointment. It looks like this year will take another talented magician, he thought. Grimm snorted that the old man was saying something nonsensical, and Riley agreed. Then they arrived at the place Riley was visiting for the first time, Windhelm, a city where it snowed all year round and a center of magical engineering. There was always something going on here. Someone was conducting experiments. The atmosphere of the city had not changed over the years. But the city itself had changed, so Grimm couldn't get his bearings, and Riley kept reading the signs on the map. She then used her search skill, and her magic drew her a mental map of the city. She told Grimma that there were about 10 buildings suitable for a management office, all of which were clean and accessible to the general public. If they had known in advance, they would have followed the old man. They would have had to endure his grumbling, but at least they would have made their task easier. Who knew that the city would change so much in 3 centuries? Grimm was indignant as they walked, but a suspicious man was already on their tail. He smiled at the city's guests and noted that they were there for the first time. A loose cloak, clearly a local one. There was a faint trace of magical energy hovering around, Grimm noticed. In front of them was a novice magician. He told them that due to the experiments, traces of residual magic made finding the path a waste of effort, but they could ask the cute guy for help. Riley stared at the cocky boy and asked Grimm what to do, but he didn't know and left the decision up to her. Riley asked him for help, and the stranger asked her where she was going, and learned that she was going to the management office. He immediately realized that the young lady wanted to take the selection test, and told her that the city was divided into several districts. The stranger kept talking to them and leading them somewhere. The alleys were already here, and there were fewer people. And Riley asked how much longer. Then he smiled a sickeningly sweet grin and said that it would take another quarter of an hour to get to the management office. But Riley wasn't asking about that. She was asking about the spell he had used on her. When the stranger did not respond, she explained that she was talking about his spell. Then he stopped pretending to be cordial and asked when she had noticed. Riley said she saw it from the very beginning. From the moment they met, he put strange accents on words. He used intonation and put magic into his words. This is the first step in creating magic. This man bewitched Riley using a charm. Realizing that he was exposed, he burst out laughing like a second-rate villain. The stranger asked why she followed him if she knew everything from the beginning. Grimm realized that the spell had to do with paralysis. If it had been carried through to the end, she would have been paralyzed, possibly to be sold to dark mages or slave traders. In Windhelm, this is a common occurrence. Children are often the victims, and there are those willing to pay well for the test subjects. But Riley followed him anyway, because this man didn't look like someone who could harm her. This hurt the pride of the swindler. She acted so arrogantly in front of him because she had reached the lowest rank at her age, and he decided to teach her a lesson. Doesn't she know that even among the lowest rank of mages, there can be a huge difference in strength? The swindler asked. Grimm agreed with the blockhead. Even though he didn't hear him, Riley was heaven compared to him. She asked the swindler how many people he had already kidnapped, and it turned out that she was the 13th. The scoundrel boasted that all this was because they fell in love with his smile, because he looked good. The stream of bragging and narcissism nearly left Riley and Grimm speechless. Grimm made faces, and Riley simply agreed with the idiot so he would shut up. And then she told him that women really do cry because of him. They actually sob at night, and how could they not cry if he was a monster and a proud man who summoned the magic of flame? A spear appeared in front of him, with the help of which he awakened the properties of flame. Even though he is a newbie, he has good control over his power, Grimma noted. The kidnapper, meanwhile, continued his incredibly long cast of the spell, during which time he could have made himself some tea. Perfect for practice, Grimma said with a satisfied grin. He threw his fire spear straight at Riley's head, who stood motionless. She looked indifferently at the dancing flames that were approaching her. Thanks to her training with the Lich, her mind became sharper, and she mastered accelerated thinking just by sending magic into her brain. Riley read the spell diagram in mid-flight like an open book. And then, quite calmly, she used dispersal, as she had done thousands of times before. The scammer asked her in amazement what she was doing, and Riley answered mysteriously, "Who knows? That's the difference in their powers." Her attack was different from the criminal's spell, a simple mass of magical energy, with no rotation or technique. However, this stream shot out indescribably quickly, no loud phrases or long casting, simple and effective. A true magic bullet, the kidnapper received a crushing blow and flew into the wall. Riley thanked him for the valuable lesson as his body slid limply to the cold ground. Thanks to him, she learned a valuable lesson. The fact that you have a high level of magic does not solve all problems. Everything depends on talent, Riley realized. And then he turned his gaze back to the kidnapper and asked Grimm whether he had died by accident. Grimm himself couldn't believe his eyes, but he didn't make a big deal out of it. He still hoped that he would wake up, but a nasty grin remained frozen on his face. Later they went around each of the 10 buildings, and unfortunately, the office was in the last one. It was already getting dark. Even though Riley checked everything constantly using pathfinding, it didn't help at all. Oddly enough, none of the residents knew the location of the office. There was a bright sign in front of the building, and Grimm was surprised that she didn't notice it right away. But there was nothing to be done, because they were deliberately trying to hide the building. Grimma asked her to mark on the map all 10 buildings that they walked around. A pentagram appeared on the map. The entire city was used as a magic circle, with special devices placed in each building that activated the circle. Riley wondered why they did this, and Grimma replied that there was only one way to find out. As they entered the spacious, empty office, the woman sitting in the chair turned to face them. She smiled warmly at Riley and congratulated her on passing the first stage of the selection test. Riley was given a seal on her hand and was told that this mark proved that she was a candidate for the test. The bearer of it could use Windhelm's services for free until the next test for a week, and in the meantime she could rest. Riley was surprised that the first test was so easy. Even though they had to walk, it wasn't difficult. The building wasn't on the map and was difficult to find with spells. The whole thing was a challenge. Overcome various obstacles, find 9 buildings, and only then can you get to the 10th. For other wizards who were less skilled at pathfinding, it was pure hell, Grimm thought. The red-haired lady warned Riley before leaving to avoid conflicts with other participants in the challenge. Grimma explained to her that there was nothing wrong with that, because there were plenty of fools who bullied others to find out the level of their opponents. And although Riley thought that this did not apply to her, Grimma warned that she might encounter provocateurs. But then they both felt something and stopped. A pinpoint aura was directed at Riley. It was a familiar magical power, the same feeling they had encountered on their way to the city. Grimma said that this is the culprit of all the murders, and his intentions can be felt from a distance. He offered to track him down to Riley, and she obediently did so. Having abandoned her vision, she looked at the world through magic. Her mana beams quickly found the corner where the killer stood, watching Riley. Riley asked what she should do, and Grim asked her if she could win. The girl was confident in herself. Then she must prepare her defense as best she can, he said, and a red flash appeared right in front of Riley. She looked at it, thinking what to do, disperse it, or just dodge it by turning her head. But the charge was flying too fast. Riley cast a double spell, blocking the flash while preparing a magic bullet. The shield will quickly break, but will allow her to avoid the blow, and at the same time prepare a blow while the killer thinks that she will only defend herself. But then Riley found there was simply no room to attack. The enemy's barrier was impenetrable, and her magical attack did not weaken. A red flash pierced her shield, and Riley didn't have time to move her head away. It was the end. She started as if she had seen a nightmare come true, and was breathing heavily. Her face was in place. Riley stood in the middle of a busy street, completely unharmed. She looked around, completely not understanding what was happening. The killer was nowhere to be seen. Mental battle, Riley heard a soft female voice next to her. A situation that occurs with special concentration during a battle. You need to find your opponent and feel his murderous intent. The stranger removed her hood and asked if Riley had just seen her death. Grim noticed the same inverted pentagram pattern on her hand. She was a participant in the test. The horrible scene of carnage that this woman had left behind flashed before their eyes. Grimma told Riley to be careful. There was no telling what to expect from her. Despite the stranger's sweet smile, Grim considered her a psychopath. Among those who use magic to kill, there are no normal people. But instead, she took them to lunch at an expensive restaurant and treated Riley to delicious food. This was the best restaurant. Even the Lords of the Five Towers come here after the end of the exam. The stranger told her to eat properly and not answer. She promised to pay for the food, thus apologizing for her rudeness in the past. Riley was immediately taken in by the food, so she whispered to Grimma that she liked the stranger, who only grumbled in response that she shouldn't be friends. But Riley lived by the principle that there could be no bad people among those who bought her food, and Grim couldn't believe that dinner was so delicious. All because in the musty cave of the Lich they ate terrible food. Grim replied that the skeleton would be upset to hear such a thing. The whole time they were visiting him, he worked hard and cooked for Riley, using rare ingredients and expensive herbs. But what can you do if it doesn't taste good? Riley answered childishly. But now there was something more important. The witch introduced herself as Rebecca Duncan, and asked to call her Becky. She was glad to meet Riley and smiled sweetly at her. The psycho killer was a real pain in the ass for Grim despite her cute face. After dinner, Riley thanked her for the treat, and Becca just laughed. At 27 years old, this sorceress reached an advanced level and came to Windhelm for testing. She smiled and told Riley that there was no need to thank her so much. After all, in any case, everything was free for the test subjects' print carriers. Riley remembered what the manager at the branch had said. She hadn't used this privilege yet. Becca reminded her that some places offered free perks. And this restaurant is no exception, Becca said, showing the employee a sign when he brought her the bill. The sorceress called Riley naive. She was amused by the girl's expression, so she laughed again, but immediately apologized for it. Only Grim knew that if Riley was looking at him with such a distant gaze, she was actually incredibly angry. Becca asked her what she was going to do, and Riley replied that she was going to spend the night nearby. Becca objected to this, saying that this was not possible. Even in those objects that provided 5 towers there was a difference, and demanded a map and a list from her. The sorceress recommended the Blue Whale Inn to Riley. Good soundproofing, nice owner, and the best food. She marked all the hot spots on Riley's road map, and thought that would be enough. Riley asked if she would go with her, but Becca replied that she would stay with a friend in the city. Becca immediately offered to go with her, but Riley categorically refused. Given his experience, Grimma was confident that Becca was sincere and would actually take Riley home with her. Riley wanted to know why Becca was so interested in her, but Grim didn't know either. Although he assumed that the witch was surprised that a newbie like Riley could pass the test, and Becca wants to know what skills she has. For someone who knew nothing, he had come up with a very plausible hypothesis, Riley noted, and Grim muttered that it was just a guess. People of the same class recognize each other, Riley noted, and he asked her if she thought she was talking to a madman. Becca wished her a good rest and to see her again at the next test. Grim thought how unusual it was to see a genuine smile on the face of a ruthless killer. She dealt brutally with the bandits, and the less they knew about the enemy, the more dangerous he was. Grimma asked Riley to continue the dialogue. Riley did just that and also wished the witch a quick meeting. She also expressed hope that the next time they met, they would be able to fight together. She also asked her not to scare her with illusionary magic, which stunned Becca. Becca even asked if she heard correctly, but Riley confirmed it. Their first meeting was an illusory battle. After the collision, Riley returned to the real world. Becca called it a mental battle, and that really did exist. But Riley recognized that she had fallen under her spell. Becca couldn't hide her surprise. This was truly an amazing girl in front of her. Only high-level magicians could catch the spell. Since ancient times, there was only one way to detect an illusion: confidence. Riley knew that she would never die at the hands of an incompetent. Mana control, amount of magic power, spell speed. Each of the abilities increases your rank, and this difference is not easy to overcome. Riley had heard some cocky talk before today, and the person who had spoken it was lying with a hole in their chest in a dirty alley. Riley knew how to fight back against a strong opponent, and this had happened several times before. Becca looked puzzled. Fighting the Lich, or his chimeras in the lab, was all Riley's experience. Even today's battle complemented and confirmed her abilities. Becca laughed again and offered to attack Riley if she wanted, but she just replied that she was ready for anything. Becca said she understood her intentions. If she ignored the manager's warning, she could simply be expelled. Riley said it was a lie and that her opponent was running away in fear, so Becca agreed to meet the little bug during testing. It was a lot of fun for Becky. She had already met a lot of weirdos. Riley replied that she had fun too and learned a lot of new things. Becca told her to take care of herself until the test. She had fun today, after which her image melted into a reddish haze. They watched as it dissolved into thin air. It really was a clone, Riley told her mentor in her mind. Grimma agreed. The real body could be on the other side of the city. It was a great technique. Becky, all the time, there was a strange flow of magic that could not flow in living beings. If not for the high sensitivity to magic, they would not have noticed anything. Now Riley understood the reason why Becca was interested in her. She was just curious how quickly someone with such sensitivity would realize that she was just a clone. I wanted to see Riley's face and was actually waiting for her to be exposed, which is probably why the flow sometimes became stronger. But why did Grimm wonder about this? Riley simply answered him cheerfully. She enjoyed the thrill of being found out, said Riley, who had access to the thief's senses. Grimm stopped understanding anything and clapped her. It was surprising that Riley was able to understand the thoughts of the crazy witch. The observer was talking to someone using a ball on the table and was looking through the questionnaires of the participants. His student was also among them in this test. The red-haired manager told her junior to put the memories aside and move on. There was a lot of interesting things ahead of them. A piece of paper with Riley appeared in his hands. She was assigned a low rank. She wanted to pass the test as soon as possible. Such arrogance was typical for the students of the academy. The manager asked him if he knew how much time Riley had spent looking for an office, and he suggested at least 3 months wandering around the city. But the red-haired mentor answered him that not at all. Riley arrived in the city this morning. This means that it took her only half a day to find the managing office. Becca was the fastest to do it. It only took her 4 hours. She used 20 clones, which turned the whole city upside down. The average search time was a week. Even Garen, a high-ranking expert, needed a day. It turned out that little Riley was one of the best, said the bespectacled man. The red-haired mentor grinned. She confirmed her guess. This year they will have something to see. She remembered the shaggy sorceress with eyes the color of the sun. Riley decided to get some rest before the next challenge. So she woke up in the afternoon, had breakfast, took another nap, and then went to lunch, only to end up lying in bed again until dinner. And after 3 days of total idleness, she felt completely exhausted from such a rest. Then Riley dressed up and decided to go for a walk, as Grimm advised her. She had to spend some money because these clothes were expensive, but she still had some money left, the money she took from the academy. They came to a place where there were quite a lot of people. The Central Library of Arcadia, Grimm told her. This building was hundreds of years old. It was the second largest library after the Imperial Academy, and most of the books related to magic were stored here. Riley suggested they go in, since there was nothing else to do, and she had the right to enter, but Grimm wasn't very fond of libraries. Of course, for simple students, visiting Arcadia will be a useful experience. Many good books, magical gatherings. But he still doubted, because he had been stuck in such a cursed place for 3 good centuries, among countless books and books and books. Riley told him that he couldn't avoid libraries forever. Grimma agreed with her. There was no other way to get information in this age where there was no earthly technology. He had to overcome his fear. Then Grimma said, "Why not go inside and close your eyes to the worries? Even if he comes in and doesn't like something, he can always leave," he thought, and ran inside. It was incredibly beautiful inside, and Riley stood there for a long time with her mouth open, looking at everything. Grimm said the books were well arranged and didn't feel like they were just thrown together like in an academy. Riley received a platinum library pass, which allowed her to enter any section. That's why the first thing she did was go into the closed section with forbidden books. 2 books from the general collection is one thing, and the forbidden section is another, Grimm said. Riley wanted to know about the 100 great men and the attributes. They walked between shelves that were drowning in shadow, so as soon as Grimm saw the light, he dragged her there. When they came out from around the corner, their flashlight illuminated the face of an old man who had clearly visited a beauty salon and a barber shop. It was the same old man with whom they came to the city. He asked Riley how she got into the closed section. Then the girl showed him the eloquent inverted pentagram on her hand. The old man praised her for passing the first test with such a terrible technique. Grimm grumbled again. What was wrong with this old man, he asked. A terribly irritating person, he had already thoroughly irritated him with his moralizing on the way to Windhelm. Even though Riley received her certificate for passing the test, the old man's opinion of her did not improve. The old man from the barber shop looked at her and told Riley to surrender. The test will be far more brutal than she thinks, and the moment the smell of blood spreads, everything will turn into a massacre for the sake of rivalry. A wizard who has practiced for years may still survive, but for an inexperienced beginner, this is a deadly test. He offered to test her later. Riley replied that she appreciated his concern, but had already made her decision. The old man said it was stupid, but as befits young people, she was full of energy. Riley replied that people liked her for her courage, but he said that she was talking nonsense. There was no courage in recklessness. Then the old man decided to show himself, and the flow of mana around him increased. He challenged Riley to a duel, his eyes blazing menacingly in the dim light of the library. If she wants to pass the test, she has to fight him, the old man from the barber shop said. Riley didn't understand what he wanted or why, and the old man said that this was an unusual competition. He would not attack. And he promised to give Riley 3 tries, the old man said confidently. If he moved even one step, victory was hers. If she could give him a good fight, then she would pass the test, he believed. Grimm reluctantly agreed. There was sense in the strong old man's words. He immediately recognized in this fashionista a high-ranking expert, of whom there were no more than 50 on the continent. Among those who passed the selection test, he could be the strongest. Grimm suggested that Riley deliver a good blow and show his abilities. Riley asked the old man what would happen if she didn't land a good hit, and he assured her that he wouldn't let her participate in the test. When she asked how exactly, he promised to simply attack her with all his might. Although he just said that he wouldn't attack, what a crazy old man, Grimm was amazed. The old man told her not to worry. He wasn't going to kill her. He was just going to break her legs so she wouldn't pass the test. And then they both thought they had met another crazy person. Greybeard asked her why she was making that face, and Riley replied that her pride was hurt. The pensioner asked her in surprise if she wanted to fight without restrictions, and Riley nodded. The old man sighed heavily and agreed, asking her to take the book out of her bag. Grimm didn't understand why he needed a book, but the old man had already taken one of them, about the 100 great men of the Empire. It was a good book, almost without distortion, he said, leafing through it. And then he brought Riley back and suggested reading chapter 67. Garen, read Grimm. A man famous for his feat in fighting 100 demons. The Emperor highly praised the man's achievement and inducted him into the Hall of Fame, with a portrait attached to the article. Not all high-ranking wizards were of the same level, although some trained to the point of exhaustion just to improve their skills. There are still those who raised their level on the bloody fields. Even among those who had won glory on the battlefield, old Garen commanded respect. And now he was standing right in front of them, the teacher and student pair finally realized. Riley said 3 tries was not enough and asked for 5. Garen called her shameless, and she replied that she was just kidding. Still, this wasn't the best place for a duel, Riley noted. It was too crowded. Garen told her not to worry about it, and with a snap of his finger, he pulled the shelves apart, clearing the arena for them. He also put up a barrier that limited her magic to outside of that area, so she didn't have to worry about breaking anything. Riley was surprised and asked what if she did get past this barrier, and then the old man said that all objects were protected. Then there was nothing more to worry about, and she could begin. Grimm himself was curious to know how effective her attack would be against the expert. He told her to pin down that old guy from the barber shop to find out. He also reminded her that if they didn't succeed, he would break her legs so that she wouldn't be able to walk. Every wizard goes through 2 awakenings, the name given to those who instinctively realize the truth about magic and mana. The second awakening is growing up. The magician receives the power of the attribute, and his abilities grow exponentially. Wizards who have reached this age have no choice but to become stronger naturally. Wizards who have overcome 2 awakenings before reaching adulthood are considered monsters in their own right. Garen wanted to see such a talent blossom. That's why she shouldn't participate in the testing. He repeated the conditions to Riley again. Even though his method was cruel, there was nothing he could do for her to understand. Riley instantly gathered her magic bullet, and a blue ball appeared in her hand. It was a quick attack. Garen stood still as he promised and watched her attack. A heavy attack, filled with magical power without any frills. He put up a magical shield in front of him. He didn't even need an attribute. But then Garen felt something strange and shuddered, as if he was paralyzed. It wasn't magic, but rather fear that came over him as if he was on the threshold of death. On the battlefield, she had crossed this line hundreds of times, Garen thought. He always fought face to face and never retreated from monsters or enemies. But now he felt the same feeling because of some little girl. Garen couldn't figure out what was going on, and Riley's magic bullet still hadn't disappeared. His shield slowly disappeared, and then he realized she had cast Dispel. Garen turned around and saw another magic circle behind him. Riley intercepted her own bullet before the shield disappeared because she didn't want another corpse on her conscience. The old man realized that it was all intentional, all because of the start of the attack. He was too smug when he thought she was a simpleton. Garen realized that he lacked the confidence of this girl. Riley used her magic bullet again, and their duel continued. Now she threw it in a broken trajectory so that it was impossible to tell where it would hit from. The old man once again held out a simple magic shield in front of him. But this time, it cracked under her attack. Riley had aimed at the thinnest part of the spell, not something a weak wizard could notice. Moreover, Garen noticed that he had moved, just a little. Riley had a great affinity with mana, allowing him to find holes in his opponent's magic, and an understanding of techniques to take advantage of weaknesses. This girl was definitely being helped by an archmage, Garen realized. The duel was over. These were definitely not the skills that a simple student could learn. Riley was definitely a genius who easily overcame the differences in rank. Garen had no choice but to admit that this little girl would survive the selection test. Riley approached him and said she had one more try, and Garen asked if there was any point in continuing if everything had already been decided. Her second attack made him move, so as he promised, he wouldn't interfere anymore, after which the old man sincerely apologized for his presumptuous intervention. Riley asked him if he knew the girl had never removed her charge. She knew her attack had taken effect, and Garen asked why he wanted to use the next one. As he told her, she had 3 attacks, so she asked him to take a defensive stance. The old man didn't know what to answer to this. Riley seemed to have become possessed. Riley was eager to test something, despite Garen's objections. What does it mean to test? The first time he was caught off guard, the second attack already demonstrated her skill and technique. She was just using it as a warm-up. His high-ranking wizard, Garen was amazed as a powerful bolt flew at him. She's crazy, he realized, looking at the sphere of mana flying towards his face. But Garen was not hurt, as expected. High-ranking wizards are different. He praised Riley for the unusual attack. If she had more magical powers at her disposal, his life would definitely be in danger, Garen said, and handed Riley a handkerchief. The technique is good, but it still lacks power, Grima explained to her. This was natural, because the magic that Riley used had not yet gone through its second awakening. All that could be used without the attribute was to create anomalies using technology. This method helped to reflect the blows, and it turned out that even a high-ranking magician was picky. As they left the hall with the forbidden techniques, Garen asked to keep their competition a secret. Then the couple remembered the manager's warning to avoid conflicts. Riley replied that she didn't understand what he was talking about because she just read books. Garen asked her where she was staying and learned that she was at a hotel that a friend had recommended to her. Garen heard about the Sky Whale Inn and suspected that her acquaintance was not a very good friend, and Grima agreed she was quite the psychopath. There were places in Windhelm that were better explained by Garen and asked where her things were, and learning that Riley carried everything with him in a bag, he told her to just follow him. He guaranteed that the place they were going to was 100 times better than the Sky Whale. Grim grumbled that all housing was like this and there was no particular difference. But then they found themselves in a truly royal place, and he quickly took his words back. Riley didn't understand how Becky could think the last hotel was the best and felt cheated. Riley jumped up from her seat and said that this wouldn't work. Grim asked her what was the matter. Riley was hungry for revenge immediately and was ready to go right now. Grima said that it was their own fault for believing her, and suggested that they take revenge during tomorrow's testing. Garen studied Riley's behavior for a long time. She sometimes acted strangely. He asked her what was wrong, and she replied that she was just dizzy. She later told him that she had been dating Rebecca Duncan. Riley was surprised that Garen knew her, but it was more strange not to know her, the mage noted. He had already told her that some people thought that tests were a legitimate place to kill. And crazy Rebecca is just such a sorceress, warned Garen. Last year she was expelled from the test, precisely for excessive killing, and before that she killed the administrator. She usually restrains her urges but satisfies them by passing the test every year. Grimm said that it was not for nothing that the sorceress was considered a maniac. But Riley asked him why the 5 magic towers were leaving her alone. If the person is so dangerous, then she could have been removed at the test application stage. Grimma explained that it was easy to understand. They turned Becca into part of the test. Riley encountered a notorious serial killer, much to her misfortune. Worse, she could now become her desired target. Grimma asked her how she would act now. Later, Garen led them to the place indicated by the magic seal. The second test would be here, he thought. It looked the same as the first office. Garen invited them in and pushed the doors open first, Riley following behind him. When the doors opened, they lit up with a red magic circle. They were overcome by a feeling familiar many times, a teleport that took them to a spacious hall. It was the Imperial Palace, which was stunning in its decoration, and they looked at the empty throne. But this was not the palace that Grimm remembered. Everything was somewhat different from the Great Hall. It was a historical place where artifacts, treasures, and books were kept, and the relics were protected by guards and numerous traps. Among all the dungeons, these were considered to be the most difficult. While Grimm grumbled about such a dangerous place being a test, Riley noticed that the old man had disappeared, and he quickly found the old dandy in the crowd, his patterned cloak standing out from the others. But when Riley was about to call him, Rebecca pushed her in the shoulder. She was glad to meet them, and that they met right away. She asked how she was doing, and if she liked the whale's treats. Riley answered discontentedly that she didn't. Rebecca feigned regret and asked if things had gotten any worse. She was openly mocking her, Riley realized, and asked if Becca had been there herself. Riley said she was staying somewhere else for the remaining 3 days. Of course she was lying, Grimm realized. Riley had been there 2 days instead of 3. But then something behind them caught their attention and they turned around. Representatives of the 5 towers appeared there, wearing white cloaks, and greeted them. They promised to tell everyone about the second stage, and Becca sighed indignantly at being interrupted. She warned Riley that she would come first in the exam and make her regret that provocation last time. But Riley simply ignored the psychopath, and she walked away, indignant, and Grimm was surprised that no one immediately did anything, but only threatened. The second test is a team competition, in which 42 people will be divided into teams of 3 and compete. The teams would be determined by chance. Becca immediately grimaced. She liked to work alone. All of them must pass through the second gate of testing. They were given 30 minutes to greet their team members, and when it dawned on them, the atmosphere became tense. Riley mockingly told Miss Becca that, although it was a shame, they would have to fight another time. Grimm was quite puzzled by this. Being on a team with a psychopath was sad. There was nothing to be done now, and Riley told him contentedly that Becca had miscalculated. Grimm had warned her that anything could happen to this freak, and Riley thought she might still get attacked. The red-haired hostess asked everyone if they had any questions. Becca was the first to shout above everyone else, and the redhead asked her what was going on. She was worried about what would happen if members of the same team quarreled, and the redhead replied that this could naturally happen. But Becca interrupted her and said that wasn't what she wanted to know. She wanted to know what would happen if members of the same team fought each other. Team competition is a method by which they evaluate their level of cooperation. Becca listened carefully, obviously looking for loopholes in the rules to kill. But the red-haired manager warned that if even one team member was killed, the entire team would be eliminated from the test. Becca couldn't help but feel indignant. These were simply absurd conditions for her. The other teams were also concerned about this condition, because they now had to think about the weakest members of the team. For many, this has caused a burning sensation in the lower back, and now the strong must carry the weak. The red-haired manager interrupted all this debate and fermentation, in a word, silence. All the subjects involuntarily fell silent and looked at her attentively. This was a word spoken with the aura of a high-level mage. With its help, it is easy to silence dozens of people. Until now, they had all received good treatment simply because they could call themselves magicians. In the end, mages are priceless. No one would say a word against them, no matter how much harm they could cause. As a result of decades of such practice, the mage's character has become corrupted, their personalities destructive, and their social skills terrible. But they are no longer allowed to do this. Now everyone must act like members of one family when they enter the dungeon. That is why the second test is a team competition. The task is to see how people who have met for the first time can work together. The manager warned them that if this condition was too much for them, they should refuse right then and there. Even though Becca was incredibly angry and didn't want to do it, she still offered to cooperate with Riley, and she agreed. Grimm was surprised. Becky was really mad, but it seemed like she still had self-control and wanted to pass this test. He remembered that even at their first meeting, she said that she didn't want to be excluded. Grimm smiled. At least their teammate wasn't a complete psychopath, but Riley countered. It could all be an act. But what was more important was another member of their team, a copper-haired girl with glasses. But she kept so far away from them that they did not even hear her greeting, although a minute ago she was close. The redhead was embarrassed and said that she loved ancient magic and didn't know what else to add to her presentation. Becca suggested, starting with the name. Then the red-haired girl introduced herself as Olivia and told them that she was from Arcana's school. Becca screamed loudly when she heard the name of the school, so much so that Riley had to cover her ears. Becca threw a fit, calling Arcana's school a bunch of idiots who knew nothing but ancient magic. And even Grimm agreed with her. These people study ancient magical systems, more because they are chasing romance. Stories from fairy tales like grinding a mountain into powder, dividing the sea in two, those who chase after such nonsense are called myth-seekers. However, Grimm was surprised that they still existed after 3 centuries had passed. In any case, they now had a sociopathic killer on their team who couldn't control his anger, and a social outcast who knows useless ancient magic. And Riley, the thief, the dream team, Grimm thought, and grabbed his head. Later, Old Man Garen approached her and asked how she felt after using the teleport. Riley replied that there was no problem and asked the old man if he had a good team. The old man said that he was pleased with everything. Thanks to the first test, everyone here was a first-class magician. He wanted to know about her team, but one look at the troublemaker, Becca, was enough to understand that it was fun here. Riley stayed away because it was too noisy. Garen himself was amazed that Rebecca and a mage from an ancient school would be on the same team. It was hard to tell if it was luck or bad luck, he said. Grimma said that it doesn't matter what reputation Becky has, she really is a powerful mage. The problem was how she would act when the test began, the betrayal, the outbursts of anger, whatever. Olivia, on the other hand, was an expert in ancient magic that had little practical application, so she had no experience. The fighting strength of their squad was Becky and Riley, while the rest had 3 fighters. Grimm was becoming pessimistic. But now they could do nothing, because they themselves had chosen this test. All that was left was to endure steadfastly and resolutely. Besides, Grimm noted, they weren't the only ones having difficulties. The rest found themselves in exactly the same situation. They don't know who they will work with. Grimma said they must overcome these challenges by finding their team's strengths and working together, and start working as a single whole. That is the essence of the second test. Of course, it was expected that working with such abnormal people was simply unreasonable, he noted, looking at the arguing couple. Garen told Riley that it was time for him to go, and he was glad to see that she was okay despite his concerns. It wasn't until he left that Riley realized they were now enemies, but she was confident they would pass the test and achieve the results they wanted. Grimm gave her a reassuring pat on the shoulder. Riley was sure of it too. When the time was up, the red-haired manager asked them again if they had finished their greetings, after which she opened a portal and said that this was the entrance to the ruins where the test would take place. Then she showed them what the artifacts and treasures looked like. The ball in the assistant's hands emitted a beam of blue light at her will. It took Becca a moment to realize what had appeared on the blue screen. This golem was explained to them by the red-haired manager, pointing to a golden robot in the form of a cat. The test lasts for 24 hours, and there are 2 ways to take it, she said. The first way to get a golem core from a cat by the end of the test. The second condition is that all team members must remain alive. Grimma immediately figured out the whole arrangement based on these conditions. Find the golem, get the core, survive with all team members, and hold out for a day. That's all there is to treasure hunting in the dungeon. As long as we are only talking about hidden guards and traps, it does not seem like something dangerous. Many magicians thought so. But then the red-haired manager told them what the catch was. There were only 3 golems. 42 participants, 14 teams, and only 3 will pass the test, only 20%. Grimma was indignant. Moreover, it was impossible to forget that there was no guarantee that all 3 golems would be found. All this would give rise to an extremely high and fierce struggle. How cruel, Riley marveled, but Grimm replied that the 5 towers encouraged such competition. They are ruled by a meritocracy, the government is better, so they still need to pit people against each other. The manager warned that the most dangerous creature in the dungeon is the Chimera, a dangerous creature created solely for the purpose of killing. But for some reason these monsters seemed familiar to Grimma. The manager said that perhaps some of them had already seen this creature. 5 years ago, there was a Lich invasion of the Empire, she said. And these were the same chimeras that were attacking the citizens back then. Grimm screamed in indignation when he realized this. As soon as they enter the portal, they will be thrown into a random place in the dungeon, along with their entire team. Even though the test was not easy, the manager wished them to enjoy it and gain the glory of the 5 towers. At this point, she invited everyone in and announced the start of the second test. Somehow Grimm ended up becoming the mastermind. More importantly, the place they found themselves in was fucking huge. It felt like they were dwarves in the middle of a giant's palace, Grimm said. They all perked up when they heard the eerie sound and looked in its direction. A giant guard walked down the corridor. His arms and legs were chained so he couldn't run, but with his height reaching the ceiling, there was no need to. Riley was amazed. The creators of this test clearly used the wrong words to warn them of the danger. The word obstacle did not reflect the full horror of what lay before them. Riley thought that after moving, they needed to avoid the monsters and just look for the golem. Grima agreed. Apparently they were thrown into the red zone, the most dangerous, he said. Every one of his 1,000-year-old instincts screamed at him not to touch this guardian. It would take 3 or 4 masters of Garen's level to even try. Who in their right mind would provoke such a monster? Grim asked. But then Becca suggested fighting this monster, and Grim remembered who exactly they were on the team with. But when Becca was already moving towards him, Riley grabbed her hand tightly and told her to wait. The monster was beckoning her. Riley turned to Olivia and asked her to help her hold Becca, but she kept breaking free. Riley stood her ground. They didn't even know how strong this monster was. Becca replied that she would find out just by fighting him. If they fought and lost, they would die, and even if they miraculously won, they would gain nothing from it. Riley reminded them of common sense. But Becca said that great power was needed to use it. Of course, no one believed her, despite the talk that fighting and defeating a strong enemy is the meaning of a magician's life. No sane person would want to fight this monster unless it was crazy Becky. Why are they all battle maniacs like Becca? Grim wondered when another team appeared. Becky kept grumbling that they were just wasting their chance. But Riley just pointed her finger at her and suggested that she look there. The self-confident mage surrounded himself with power and told his comrades to get ready. He fired a ball of magic straight at the monster and a powerful clot flew towards him. The giant Dahaka looked at the charge flying towards him, which seemed simply tiny. Even after the feeble-minded and brave wizard used his ultimate magic, it left no trace on the monster's body. And then the 3 idiots just froze in place, watching as a huge, padded boot came down on them. The giant simply crushed the stupid magician as if he were a cockroach. The remaining 2 had to flee in haste to avoid repeating the fate of their comrade. Then the giant swung his long halberd. Looking at this annihilation, Becca asked if they should just look for the golem's core. Riley used her first skill, search, and looked at the dungeon with her mind's eye. Her vision was limited to this dungeon, and she asked Grim if it was always like this. He replied that it was not usual. It was one of the most dangerous dungeons, so the difficulty level was naturally high. But no matter how you look at it, there really were a lot of obstacles, all kinds of mana interference, and disruptions in its perception, even ancient spells. There were many layers here that were difficult to break through. Grima asked how much longer she would use the search. The girl replied that she would need another 5 minutes, or even 3 if she hurried. Mana restriction zones. Getting into one is like going blind for a mage. It wouldn't be surprising if Riley became frustrated by this. But she was fine, Grim noted, just like someone else, Grim thought as he looked at Becca, who was complaining about how hard it was to see through the layers of mana. Becca asked Olivia if she had a better method. They had to find the golem but couldn't use pathfinding. But the girl was embarrassed and said that ancient magic was not very useful in searches. Becca was indignant that she did not even know how to cast a regular spell. Even without combat skills, she should have at least had some auxiliary magic, which meant she was completely useless, Becca said. Becca asked her to raise one of her hands, and Olivia obediently did so. And then she ordered him to use that hand to hit her oak head. Grim saw how Becca again took it out on the weak. Olivia remembered that they could use Becky's clones since they couldn't use pathfinding, and Grimma remembered that was how she passed the first test. It was a good idea. With so many clones, it was only a matter of time before they found the golem and checked all the routes. Of course it sounded so easy in theory, Grim noted. And Becca summoned her clone, who appeared from the reddish haze. Let's say she sent them out throughout the dungeon, just like Olivia suggested. Because of the shared feelings with the clones, the information wouldn't be hard to gather. It's like having scrying crystals all over the place, but it will only work if the clones remain intact. Becca began to strangle her copy. It was impossible to avoid all the traps and monsters in the dungeon and control all the clones. Managing clones consumes a huge amount of mana, so if they all die and their team then encounters another one. If the clone is destroyed, the mana will be lost, so Becca did not use them for reconnaissance. She turned to Riley and asked if she had any ideas because she was already tired because of Olivia and asked what she was doing. But Riley responded sharply that she had already taken it out, and then summoned a map of the dungeon in front of her. It transformed into a compact diagram that hung in front of them. What is this? Becca and Olivia were amazed, and Riley muttered that it was a search for a path, although it looked completely unusual. It took her half a year to modify the spell, and now it was a completely different magic. Grim suggested giving it a name. She was coming up with names for all the techniques in the Thieves' Guild, and then Grim suggested trying it. Ultra Mega Super Pathfinding, she said. But the map Riley had drawn up was accurate, stopping everyone just before the traps were triggered. Becca was amazed. Riley had already saved them from various traps numerous times, as if they were walking with a member of the Thieves' Guild. High mana affinity and the agility of a thief, these were Riley's talents. She asked if Becca had seen any thieves, but she replied that it was just a saying. Other mages would have to keep a mana shield up all the time and surround themselves with it to avoid dying accidentally, but they would be limited because of this. This will drain their strength, and when they meet the monsters, a terrible end will await them. Olivia noticed something and screamed, and Becca told her to keep quiet. They found several unlucky mages. Their bodies showed that they had been dealt with by monsters. They died without resistance, because they were tired. Thanks to Riley, they passed the trap zone without wasting mana. Becca recognized her skills and contribution to the common cause. Riley countered that Becca could have just said thank you, but Becca immediately threw a fit because the girl ruined such a moment. Riley responded that Becca was always lying and couldn't be trusted, and she was outraged that no one had ever called her a liar. But while they were arguing endlessly, Olivia began to shake like a leaf. She loudly asked them to shut up, because they were arguing right over a pile of bodies. Olivia said that they should at least close their eyes to calm their souls. Looking at her, the girls fell silent. Becca grabbed her hand and asked why Olivia was doing something that wasn't necessary. Olivia was surprised and asked if Becca didn't feel sympathy for their fate. That's why inexperienced fools are upsetting, Becca said, because she was told not to touch corpses without a reason. The shiny slime on their corpses is the saliva of hounds, the saliva of monsters. Monsters have incredible senses and can track their own scents. What would she do if that happened? Becca asked. Olivia apologized sheepishly, and Becca told her not to worry about it, but to be careful now that they were in the dungeon. Becca asked why Riley was staring at her like that. She was surprised that the crazy woman just didn't let Olivia touch the spit. Becca said she valued her life, although she was ready to fight the giant. But this was different. A cold-blooded battle face-to-face was her pleasure. But the hounds are a worthless bunch, Becca declared when she noticed the other mages in front of her. She looked for opponents of her level, and 3 appeared in front of them, holding their magic at the ready. Becca exclaimed happily. This was their first battle with mages, and they also stood at the ready. But then they saw how the monster grabbed the magician from the oncoming trinity and gave him a gentle bite. A girl from the other team screamed that she couldn't see anything and didn't understand what had attacked them. A ghost-like monster grabbed her and killed her instantly. Becca clamped her hand over Olivia's mouth to keep her from squealing in fear, and they all ducked around the corner. Grim looked at what was happening with disgust. The test was really cruel. Just looking at it made him want to vomit. Olivia was barely able to keep from vomiting. Rebecca was whispering to her to swallow or they would all die. Grimma asked his student if she wanted to fight this invisible chimera. The girl looked out from around the corner, where only by the bloody splashes could one understand that there was a monster there. She asked Grim if she should do it, although there was no one nearby who could stop them. Moreover, as the monster ate, its body gradually became visible, she noticed. Excellent, said Grimma. Time to stretch a little. Riley asked Becky to stop hiding and show herself right now. She used to say that she was looking for thrills, and now was a great opportunity. The girl smiled at her. Becca clearly enjoyed this conversation and was immediately drawn into the excitement. When they emerged from their hiding place, the monster interrupted its gruesome meal. Grim exclaimed, "Great, let's go," as if he was also taking part in this. The monster growled. Maybe she was trying to warn them about something, but no one understood the animal language. The monster gathered magical power in its mouth, and it became clear that it was about to attack. Riley cast a dispelling spell on him, instantly reading his magic. Riley was even upset that everything worked out so easily and called the monster pathetic. Although people say you shouldn't disturb a dog while it's eating, Riley said. Becca appeared behind the monster and called out to Riley to distract him. She told her that Riley was incredibly beautiful and impressive as a child. There was no hesitation in her actions, Becca said as the monster lunged at her. But his terrible mouth grabbed the air, and Becca hung lightly above him. She declared that Riley was still far from her level. Was it really worth saying something so childish? Riley was surprised. The monster growled again, and really wanted to grab the sorceress who was hanging right in front of his nose. She taunted the monster, doing an excellent job of acting as bait. The freak could not understand where the real target was and where the fake was and continued to pursue it. Riley wondered if she should just end it right there. Becca, who had actually been hiding around the corner all this time, gave her approval. They both fired their attack spells from 2 different directions. The red and blue magic bullets struck crosswise. All this time, Olivia huddled in the corner in fear and could do nothing to help. Becca told her it was over, and when Olivia didn't respond, she screamed loudly. A stream of curses poured from her lips, so much so that Grim covered Riley's ears, although she had heard worse curses in the Thieves' Guild. Surprisingly, Becca showed quite a lot of attention to Olivia and cared for her. From what they saw on the way here, Becky's cries show her concern. Despite her reputation and her mannerisms, she didn't seem like the sociopath they thought she was, Grimma said. Of course, she is egocentric and aggressive, ready to start a fight at the first meeting. Sometimes does crazy things without any hesitation. But if you think about it, she acted exactly like Riley. Grim was surprised. In any case, one could conclude from observations that she does not kill for fun. But how then should we treat the warning that Garen gave them, saying that Becky is a maniac? This really made Grimm worry about what would happen if the two were to collide, and whether they would be able to figure out what was true and what was false. Olivia prayed again for the repose of the dead souls, the great mother of magic. The team waited patiently for her to perform this senseless act of compassion. After the prayer, Olivia felt better, and Becca asked her why all this trouble was necessary. Olivia was immediately embarrassed, because she thought the answer was obvious, for the sake of the dead. But Becca was not satisfied with this. Then Olivia launched into a lengthy religious explanation about how the Mother of Magic guided their souls, and so on. Grimm summed it up again. It was a rule of Olivia's school, which made it look more like some kind of religious sect full of superstitions. But Riley also had a question for Olivia, and she turned to her. She remembered how they had previously found out that Olivia couldn't even use basic search magic. There were no pathfinding spells among the ancient magics. Riley repeated her words. That's why she wanted to know how she managed to pass the very first test. Rebecca also became curious about how such a fool could do this. Grimm became wary. He wanted to know what ancient magic she used for this task. Olivia told them that the rules did not say that a person had to find the management office themselves. So she asked a mage from the Guides Guild, whose specialty was finding the way to find this place for her. Although Olivia hated to brag, she knew ancient magic better than anyone else in her school, and was a genius, so she considered herself worthy of the 5 towers. There is no one else like her in the world, the girl answered, embarrassed and blushing. She just couldn't find the office herself. When she asked others, they didn't know either. It would be unfair that a genius like her couldn't find a way, the red-haired beast screamed. So she desperately asked the mage who had just passed the test. Grimm admitted that it was a good idea to borrow someone else's power in the test, and although Olivia tearfully begged them, no one helped her, which was natural, Grimm muttered. Although Olivia was polite, she was treated as if she was crazy, and told that anyone who couldn't handle it on their own wasn't worthy of taking the test. Grimm said he would have told her the same thing, but the more he listened to her, the less he understood how she had managed to do it. That's why she used torture magic, Olivia said modestly. Of course, torture magic, Grimm repeated after her. There were several terrifying spells of ancient magic, and Olivia was the one who understood torture magic best, so the guy didn't have a chance. Olivia was terribly embarrassed to use this spell, but she had no choice. It sounded plausible, but Rebecca was surprised that the test directors had allowed it to happen. But the red-haired manager in the office accepted Olivia. Her mana flow was suitable. If she managed to find an office, it was proof of her abilities, Olivia said. Rebecca chuckled contentedly, as if she had heard a good joke. The girl was a real psycho, and she also told them about respect for the dead. Olivia countered that she had been quite sincere at the time. Becca laughed and yelled at Riley to look at this crazy woman, after which she couldn't come to her senses for a long time and laughed until her stomach hurt. And Grimm thought that there were no normal people in this team. It's been 12 hours since the test began, and they still haven't found the golem's core. Still running away, Grimm asked, and Riley answered yes. The condition of the second test is to find the core of the golden golem. To get it, you need to capture it. The problem is that even if you detect the golem, it runs away, dodging all the traps. It was for this reason that they did not catch this nimble cat in half a day. Rebecca sighed heavily. Catching even one cat was ridiculously difficult for them. But there was good news, Riley said. There were 2 golems right next to them, and they stopped moving. Garen's companions looked at the core in the boy's hands. He said that they had finally found it. Of course, the old wizard did most of the work. A living legend straight from the barber shop, Sir Garen looked thoughtfully into the distance. He held off hundreds of monsters on his own. The guy was glad that he was on the same team with him. There's no point even thinking about what would happen if they met as enemies. The guy suggested taking a break now that they had the golem core. Garen agreed. Even if he needed rest, they had time for it. He looked at the guy named Arpel to ask him a question. Has he had any questions since they arrived in this place? From Arpel's expression, he realized that it was not, and asked to hand over the golem core. There was a special magical power in the core. Garen had never encountered anything like it. It was a special core created by the Great Towers for testing. But why did they have to spend half a day searching for a core with such a powerful force inside? Even though the entire space was covered in interference, how could they not have detected this power at all? April had been on the path of magic since childhood. He was lucky with his family, and he reached the highest rank at the age of 29. He thought about Garen's words. It was some kind of nonsense. Even an experienced magician couldn't detect it. Arpel asked what the reason was, and Garen replied that it was another trick of the 5 towers, and suggested that they take a look at it. The golem was covered in dragon skin, which allowed it to hide perfectly, which is why it was so difficult for them to find the cat. Arpel was amazed why the five towers were using such a jewel for some kind of test. Garen looked at the guy as if he had said something stupid with his disdain. It was just a test, but in the world of magicians, a lot depended on it. But that wasn't all the barbershop regular wanted to ask. 42 candidates have begun the test. It is not known how many are left, but they are all quite experienced, the old man said. Now that the core beneath the dragon's skin had been discovered, how would the situation change? Garen asked. And then it dawned on the boy. The selection was originally not aimed at finding the core, but at taking it or protecting it, Garen said, and they noticed that they were already surrounded. The team that catches the golem first will be quite experienced, but the moment the dragon's veil is torn off, everyone will know where the core is. Now they were becoming a common enemy for everyone, and this was all part of the plan of the 5 great towers, Arpel realized. Now it is unclear how the others will behave, and what will happen if several teams collide. Teams could team up, or on the contrary, hinder each other, while others would simply watch from the sidelines and wait for the right opportunity. Arpel asked Garen why, knowing all this, he didn't remove the core immediately before the end of the test. Then the smug old man declared that since they were going to fight anyway, wouldn't it be better to eliminate all the opponents at once? The magicians rushed at them from all sides, and in the end they were driven by greed and feeble-mindedness. Garen only needed to hit the staff to paralyze all the enemies. He held the core in plain sight like a sweet candy in front of children. His magic wrapped itself around the throats of the hapless wizards. They couldn't breathe, let alone cast a spell before Garen's power lifted them into the air. The white-haired girl from their team praised the old man who used the idea of the 5 towers as a trap. Garen told Dorothy and Arpel to be ready, just as he looked like he had just walked out of a beauty salon despite the chaos. If they join forces, they can easily deal with 10 small fish, he said. Rebecca caught a trace of magic in the air and turned to Riley. This magical power definitely belonged to the golem, and it was necessary to follow its trail and quickly. But Riley gave a short no and headed in the opposite direction. Rebecca insisted on quickly getting the core that the other team had already taken. Riley reminded her of the obvious. All the simpletons thought the same way, and by the time they got there would probably be other teams there already. Becca was nervous and asked the confident girl what they should do then. While everyone's attention is focused on one core, they can just go for the other one. There's another golem nearby, Riley said. Becca still wouldn't let up, so Riley approached her formally. She asked Miss Becca if she had ever regretted following her advice. Becca resigned herself and allowed Riley to do whatever she saw fit. The other candidates weren't as good at finding their way as Riley, Grimma thought. Unless they had enough power to break through the distortions, but that's not something that's available all the time. The other candidates could find the golem by luck alone, Riley told him, and Grimma replied that the examiners would go crazy if that happened. Right at that moment, the core that was barely visible suddenly became bright for everyone, like a lighthouse in the ocean. Naturally, the candidates would rush towards it. The sounds of a terrible battle reached them, and everyone shuddered. Chaos was growing, Grimm noted, and Riley asked him why the core had suddenly made itself known, and he suggested that this was the examiner's plan. Riley wondered if someone could have deliberately reduced the core's visibility in order to then strengthen it and eliminate competitors. Grimm asked her who could be crazy enough to do such a thing, and thought that there was one right in front of him. Becca didn't stop while the other teams were casting spells and fighting. They were just walking. She was going crazy with boredom after wandering for so long. Olivia tried to console the battle maniac that they would soon find what they were looking for. Becca casually asked why Olivia had chosen ancient magic as her specialty. The girl was surprised by the sudden question, and Becca replied that she was simply bored to death. Ancient magic is the most unpopular branch. There is no practical application, and others look down on them. Riley also looked at Olivia, wondering why she would get involved in something like that. Riley said that Becky was also from a similar school. Her specialty was illusion, and the sorceress was indignant. Their positions were completely different. Becca had different basic magic, but Olivia only had one type of magic, which made her a suitcase without a handle. Grimm agreed with this statement. Olivia was focused solely on the ancient. No pathfinding, no basic elements, nothing that can be used in combat. There had to be some reason she'd sacrificed the other directions, and Becca wanted to know it. Olivia replied that she simply loved the stories she heard as a child, the legends of forgotten magicians. She listed a few names, and Riley looked at Grimm. Olivia said it was great to learn about the great archmages of the past, and Becca agreed they were good. Stories from fairy tales about how magic moves mountains or divides the sea in two. But those are just fairy tales, Becca replied disappointedly. Becca told her to come back to reality. You can't erase mountains and move seas apart. Even if Archmage Martha was reborn, it would be impossible. Olivia continued to argue that it was just a pointer, because there were ancient records and materials. But no one from her school had achieved the result yet, Becca said. If that were true, someone would have already demonstrated the power of ancient magic, and they would no longer be looked down upon. Olivia replied that it took time. Becca said she was talking about it because she was genuinely worried about her. The path of magic is the path that others want to follow but cannot. Is it worth wasting time on fairy tales where you can still use ancient magic? She asked Olivia if she had anything else besides torture magic, and the girl sheepishly apologized. Becca said she just wanted to bring her back to reality. She was like that once. Then she believed that illusion magic could make her strong and spent years on it. Becca asked not to take her words with hostility, even if they sound harsh. She said all this for her own good. Olivia was surprised and thanked the sorceress for this. As they walked, Riley asked her teacher what he knew and which of the two witches was right. Olivia was right when Grimm said ancient magic did exist. With one spell it was possible to destroy enemy armies. Ancient magic is not just a fairy tale, it is a part of history. Everything that he and his students achieved has now become legend, Grimm said. This is his legacy. A collection of legends, he said, and a whirlwind of books appeared before him. Riley looked thoughtfully at the dancing pages of text. If this magic was so strong, why did people forget about it? Such is the power of time. Grimm spread his hands. She studied at the academy. Magic is a stream that lies in the depths of centuries. Time goes by, years pass, and then hundreds of years later the era of wars ends. The empire united the entire continent with its power. The emperor who gathered all the lands declared an era of peace throughout the land, and then the enormous power ceased to be in demand. It was because combat magic was not needed in times of peace, Riley realized. That's all true, the teacher agreed. That's why the empire sent mages to study magical engineering to make life easier for the citizens. After which the Golden Age came, and much in the world changed due to the power of technology. Clearing dungeons was also important, so soon new magic was developed for this purpose. Firepower magic was effective in destroying enemies. But if you use something like that underground, you'll get a rock burst, as any miner will tell you. Pathfinding was designed for dungeon crawling. Magic was changed for safety and convenience. Magic that had a narrow and precise effect became dominant. The modern system values speed and precision. On the other hand, the old system with its firepower had become ancient and useless. It had simply become obsolete. Its continuity had been interrupted, and it had been forgotten. When the Empire turned to her again, there were only a handful of those who were interested in her, but the time had been lost. Legends have become myths and mere illusions. No one remembers what existed anymore. Saying this out loud, Grimm felt relieved. Riley asked if he remembered how to use the ancient magic from the war era. Of course Grimm remembered it, but what good was that if it couldn't be used? But then Riley said she wanted to study this magic. Grimm reminded her of his words again. Since there are no more wars, this magic no longer makes sense. But she optimistically stated that if war came tomorrow, ancient magic would come in handy. Grimm told her to stop talking nonsense in any case. This was not the kind of magic that was easy to learn. You need to know the ancient runes' chants. And it is also important to transform the magical patterns that are burned on the body of the magician. She will have to forget everything she knows and learn again. On top of that, she will no longer be able to use the magic she still possesses, and what's more, her best talent, mana affinity, will become useless. He asked her if she was okay with it, and Riley said she was okay with it. She decided that she would study ancient magic in her next life. Grimm chuckled and promised to help. If of course the next life exists. Then they walked peacefully through the labyrinth, until they came across a trio of magicians who were sitting and resting. Somehow they managed to catch the golem cat with a magical net under which it lay. Becca hissed. Good that they finally found their target, but another team beat them to it. Looking at their exhausted appearance, Grimm guessed that capturing the golem had taken a lot of effort. Becca was surprised that these guys caught the golem but didn't take out its core. When the cat began to escape from the nets again, one of the magicians said that he would calm him down. Riley asked why those who captured the golem did not kill it, and Grimm replied that there must be a reason. Looking closely at the cat, he noticed a dragon skin on it. Riley immediately realized that this was the reason why the core's magical power was difficult to detect, even when they were near it. They didn't want to get discovered by the other teams like they had before. Grimm told Riley to be careful as these mages were experienced. Simply put, they are strong, so you have to be careful, Becca said. They're pretty tired, so it won't be a big problem, Riley said. Fighting strong opponents is exactly what Becca did all the time, she said, and charged. She got the enemy team on their toes and urged them on. Becca laughed devilishly, and a deadly red ball sparkled in her hands. But at that very second, the leader of the enemy team fell to his knees in front of her and capitulated. Becca was indignant and asked if they were making fun of her, and angrily ordered them to start fighting. The other members of their team asked the leader what he was doing, and then she told them to shut up and lie down quickly, face down on the floor before they all became dead. Riley's team was also stunned by this decision. The opponents surrendered without a fight. Riley assumed it was because of Becky's reputation. She was a well-known person, so once they recognized her, they immediately gave in. "Please have mercy, Olivia!" the enemy leader screamed, and everyone immediately turned to look at the bespectacled woman, demanding an explanation. The opponents were willing to give up the golem if only she would not use torture magic again. Olivia smiled sheepishly and said that this was the man who helped her pass the last test. It was a very unexpected turn of events, and the team looked at the bespectacled girl with significance. The leader of the opponents awaited their verdict with the obedience of a lamb. Riley freed the cat, who had settled into her lap. He reminded her of a puppy, but Grimm said that he was more likely a Sphinx cat. He looked really cute, so Becca asked if she could pet him. But when she reached out with her hand, she received a gentle bite with all her teeth, and a stream of abuse poured out of her. Riley asked if she was okay, and Becca grumpily replied that of course she wasn't okay. "This team is full of chaos," Riley said. "At least they protected the golem without any fighting." "Avoiding unnecessary battles is the right strategy," Grimm said, "but it's understandable that the battle fanatic will be unhappy." Becky noted that Olivia was quite good at torture magic, since the leader of the other team gave up as soon as she saw her. Olivia trained her all her life, but then Becky did not understand why the girl trembled at the sight of monsters possessing such power. "The thing is, the recovery period for torture magic is 1 month," she replied, and Becca cursed again. There are always flaws in ancient magic. "She's crazy," Becky said, and Grimm wondered who was even more crazy. Becky casually asked the silly girl if she was from the South, and Olivia was surprised she figured it out. It was obvious from the way she spoke. A distinctive accent could be heard. Grimma also agreed with this. "The South is full of madmen," he said. "The most eccentric lunatics usually come from there." Riley countered that this was regional discrimination. Grimm launched into a lengthy explanation that the Empire had always exiled the most undesirable to the South, but Riley remained firm in her opinion. She was disappointed in him, and Grimm asked since when she cared so much about morality. But then Becca said that this was very interesting, because she was also from the South. Then he and Olivia quickly found a common language, realizing that they were practically fellow countrymen. Hearing this, Riley told Grimma that the South was full of madmen, and Grimma was indignant, because a minute ago he said the same thing, and she called it discrimination. When Riley was surprised, Grimm noticed that she was indeed shameless. But the girl continued to smile sweetly, pretending to be the epitome of innocence. She told him that as a child the only fairy tales she read were about a pickpocket, which her Uncle Robert had made up for her. Grimm asked who it was, and a picture of a terrible fire appeared before Riley's eyes. She replied that Robert was a member of the same thieves' guild, and Grimm asked if the stories were good. And Riley said that these were amazing stories that taught not to trust anyone and think only about yourself. There were 4 hours left until the end of the test. Riley was constantly scanning the area using pathfinding. There were no candidates in sight yet. "It had been a long day," Riley said, yawning with fatigue, "but there was still a little more to go," Grimm noted. He thought that in just a little while this tedious test would be completed, and he expected that everything would go without problems. But then they noticed a fast-moving magic that was approaching them. While the others slept, Riley had been on guard, but now she had to protect them. After casting the enemy spell, she cast a spell at him. Hearing the noise, Becca and Olivia jumped to their feet and asked Riley what happened. Riley informed them that her pathfinding had not revealed anything suspicious. Becca asked not to make her laugh so that Riley herself would not notice anything. This was impossible. Riley's sense of mana was inimitable. She could easily see through all the traps created by the owners of the 5 towers. She could easily evade them even when they were on the move. Grimma agreed with Becky. It was impossible unless the attacker was hidden under dragon scales. They saw 3 blue-scaled mages walking towards them down the corridor. They gave off a menacing aura, and Grimm noticed that they were truly willing to do anything. If they had skin, that meant this team had a golem core, Riley said. But it wasn't clear why such people would attack them. Grimm couldn't answer this. He had several assumptions, but all at the level of guesswork. Only one thing was clear. They were all extremely dangerous. The concentration of mana, the speed of the spell trajectory, and a familiar feeling swept over Riley. Grimm regretfully agreed. One of his sinister hypotheses confirmed. The girls stood at the ready and prepared for defense. The opponents also activated their mana balls in preparation for the duel. Both sides fired simultaneously, and the room was covered in a multitude of fast charges flying in jagged trajectories. The first strokes are simply reconnaissance and force, a warm-up to assess the opponent's level. They say that instruments remember the hands of their performers, and it's the same with mana. Depending on the type of magic the wizard uses, an individual imprint is formed. Magic can be filled with fast movement or violence and destruction, depending on what the wizard uses. A mage who uses pinpoint spells has pure and ordered mana, And a magician who is used to killing fills his mana with a strong intent to die. By analyzing this, you can predict the enemy's next move and understand how the battle will go. Riley said she didn't expect them to meet so soon. Familiar mana, familiar voice, Grim thought. Why of all people it had to be him? Unfortunately, everything turned out exactly like that. The magician removed the hood, and they saw the face of Garen, who maintained a fresh look in any situation. Riley asked if he had come for the core, but the old man showed that they already had a pass. Then what is the reason? She asked. And the old man rolled his eyes. He had already told her. There are people who consider this place a legal opportunity to kill someone. He also had his own purpose for participating in this test. And that goal is to kill Rebecca Duncan, the old man said ominously, his eyes flashing. Garen stated that he had a personal score to settle with this maniac and looked at Becky. Leaving her alive would bring even greater disasters to the world of magicians, he said. Riley remembered the manager's warning that if even one team member died, it would mean expulsion. Riley said she didn't like the idea of being expelled. That's why Garen called it an unfortunate coincidence at the very beginning. Becca confidently stated that she would take care of this old man, and she had other problems that needed to be solved. Riley wanted to object, but Grimma agreed with her. The student wouldn't be able to handle Garen anyway. It was all about their compatibility. Riley uses a traditional fighting style. Her main weapon is a magic bullet with a broken trajectory and high speed. On the other hand, Garen's magic is completely focused on his defense. He never shows his weaknesses. That's why the old man is the worst opponent for them. It's much better to meet the other two, said Grimma. Riley warned that it wouldn't be easy, and Becky agreed. The old man from the barber shop was a high-level expert. But as Becky already said, she loved fighting opponents of her own level. And now she had the perfect opponent in front of her, so she simply couldn't refuse the battle. Her eyes lit up with excitement. Garen warned Arapel and Miss Dorothy that their opponent would not be an easy one. Dorothy assessed the others. There was no point in worrying about a silly girl who knew ancient magic. But the second one, although she had a cute face. Unexpectedly for Dorothy, Riley was just a novice mage, and Garen confirmed this. Dorothy screamed that a low-level commoner would not pass the selection test, and Garen advised her not to get so attached to ranks. Seeing that the girl would not calm down, Garen asked Arpel to look after her. Anyway, they just need to defeat those two, Dorothy said. The old man reminded her not to let her guard down, and the girl impatiently replied that she understood. She stamped her foot on the ground, and a dark magical goo began to creep towards Riley's team. It was an attribute of darkness, Grim recognized. Garen noted that now it was just the two of them left with Rebecca. She bowed elegantly and said it was an honor to meet face-to-face with the famous Sir Garen. Becky was plunged into a first-level flashback, and the face of a girl named Sharon appeared before her eyes. It was the first time Becky had seen Garen, but her friend had talked so much about him that she felt how famous he was. Garen asked her angrily how she dared to pronounce his granddaughter's name with her filthy mouth. "Please," Sharon begged. Her face flashed before Becky's eyes again. She begged him to spare her. Riley and Grimma were transported to another dimension. They found themselves in a garden that seemed to have been grown for giants. There was no garden anywhere in the dungeon, so those two brought them here, said Grim. While he was crawling through the bushes, he saw Olivia and almost got scared. She was shaking with fear after being pulled in here. The tamed golem was with them too, and it was good news that they wouldn't have to look for it again. But now Grim was puzzled as to why they had been transported to this place in the first place. For the transfer, they used shadow shift magic. It forcibly moves the target, but it had its limitations. The biggest downside is the huge mana cost. Those two wouldn't take that much of a risk just to separate their team. The reason that gave them an advantage was that the plants were blocking their view, even if Riley used magical detection. The battlefield with limited visibility was not a good place. Grimma told her to take all the circumstances into account. Their enemies were not the same mages. There had to be a reason why they sacrificed the review. While they were wandering in the bushes, they heard voices and looked in that direction. Dorothy was indignant that the old man did not set up an ambush, although he could have, and Arpel explained that there was no honor in this. But they are not knights of any kind, the white-haired girl was indignant. Most of all, she didn't understand why she had to fight against such cowards, and she looked at Olivia. And against a low-level child, she said, looking at Riley. Why did Garen need such caution with them? Arpel reminded her again not to let her guard down, and Dorothy began to grumble again that she understood everything. The white-haired girl asked how the useless Olivia could help her. It was a 2-against-1 battle, and Grim agreed with her. The fight was unprofitable. Dorothy advised her to give up, because Rebecca was as good as dead. The old man would take care of her. Regardless of Becky's experience, she was up against a skilled mage, so Riley had to defeat these two and help her. Otherwise she might die, and they would be expelled. Grimma reported that their chances were slim. The two who detained her were mid-level mages and quite experienced. Dorothy said that they didn't want to fight either. But if she insisted on a fight, Arpel raised his hand. At Arpel's behest, a multitude of predatory plants and tenacious vines rose from the bushes. "They won't hold back," Dorothy said, her attribute of darkness spreading around. Riley looked at the carnivorous plants and immediately understood the reason why they were moved here. These were Arpel's abilities. He inherited the secret magic of the great Archmage Cromwell from his family. Riley heard the name and thought it sounded familiar, but there was no time to think. She had to nimbly dodge the double attack of the shadow and the vines like a cat. There were enemies both above and below, she realized as she jumped. Riley pressed herself to the ground again, and dark shadows were already flying towards her. Dorothy said that she didn't want to fight a low-ranking baby. It would hurt their pride as mages. But that was where the threats ended. She demanded that Riley surrender immediately. They told her she was still young and there would be many other opportunities, man-eating plants and predatory shadows, a stunning combination, Grimm said. Riley asked him what he thought about it, her face showing no concern. She asked him again if he believed she could handle them. In the vast majority of cases, it was a losing battle. Two strong enemies in optimal conditions for them. But as far as the grimoire, which is thousands of years old, can judge, defeating them was definitely possible. In his homeworld, there is a book that details different strategies, and it says, "Know your enemy as yourself, and you will win 100 battles." Grimma asked her who she thought the priority target was, and Riley said it was the guy who controlled the plants. Because he is essentially the core of their team, if you remove all the plants, the shadows that the white-haired one controls will have nowhere to hide. Grimma praised her for her guess. The vines were dangerous because they could grab, and the mushrooms could poison with spores. But here is the question of who raised the great Archmage Cromwell, and who created plant magic, asked Grimm. He trained many famous archmages, all of whom went down in history. Riley knew their names. They were considered geniuses, talented, and powerful magicians. But for Grimm, who lived for hundreds of years and raised them from fools, they remained fools. However, they were all those who always go to the end and do not give up. Riley chuckled and replied that she had heard enough bragging about his students. "Then she must know the story of Cromwell too," Grimma said. "Back then, he was a young magician who loved to grow flowers in pots. He brought him a pot, and Grimm asked Cromwell what if he liked flowers. But then he had an idea of how to combine magic and agricultural technology. They knew their opponents 100%, Grimma said, and he was confident of success." Dorothy saw Riley smiling and asked her if she was crazy. She accepted her choice and asked again if Riley was ready to surrender or fight. Riley told Grimma that the story that impressed her most as a child was about the con artist Amy, written by Uncle Robert of the Thieves' Guild. Riley stated that she would show him how Amy got rid of her flaws in this story. Riley pointed to the golem and regretfully asked to take it away since she no longer needed it. Dorothy was surprised. Old man Garen had warned them that Riley would definitely fight. "You'd have to be crazy to fight here," Dorothy agreed, looking at Riley's upset expression. She agreed that having an extra core wasn't so bad and told her to keep her hands off the cat. The cat was clearly unhappy with this arrangement, and Riley told him to hurry up and go to Dorothy, who promised to take care of him. Grimma looked at all this with disbelief and asked what her method was. "People don't defend themselves against those they consider weaker than themselves." Riley replied that she uses this psychology. Dorothy was waiting for the cat with open arms when Riley gave him the command to take a small bite. And at that very second the cat jumped on Dorothy, who was completely unexpected. He gave her a gentle cat bite on the hand, and Dorothy screamed. Arpel cried out to her in concern, but could do nothing to help. While the enemies were in confusion, Riley prepared her charge. Her magic bullet approached Dorothy's face with lightning speed. Luckily for the white-haired girl, Arpel managed to put up a shield in time. "Just one mana shield stopped that charge," Grimm noted in surprise. But Riley's spell didn't disappear, and she also used her dispersal. Arpel's shield cracked, and he barely managed to remove the white-haired girl from the line of attack. But she was still hit. Grimm praised the student for such a quick and well-thought-out move. Dorothy screamed that she was crazy and that setting ambushes was ignoble. But Riley objected that they were not knights to have fair fights. And besides, she was fighting alone against two. The question was whether to fight or surrender. So Riley told them they would fight, and told the losers to attack. Meanwhile, Garen from the barbershop was still having menacing staring contests with Becca. Becca simply mocked him and said that his words cut her to the heart. She appeared right in front of him and said that even if others insulted her, he should not do it. Becca was expelled on the last exam because she killed half of the test subjects. She told the old man that she had avenged Sharon for him. 2 years ago there was a similar test, and the subjects ran away from the volleys of magic. Becca was the first to cross the line and set a new record, raising her hand in triumph. She turned back to see where Sharon was and how far away she might be. But then she saw the worried faces of the other magicians. They were all depressed. Sharon ran away from the stone giant and he almost caught up with her. She screamed and begged to be saved and was on her last breath. Rebecca froze in place, not understanding why her friend was there. But no one ran to help her. Instead, Becca saw how others simply mocked her weakness. Becca stood on the other side of the barrier and could do nothing to help. The mages just watched as Sharon was killed by the monster. Looking at this, Becca was overcome with anger and a mixture of contempt. "That's why she took revenge for Sharon," Becca told the old man. "It's all because they let her die. They could have saved the girl, but they just stood there and even mocked her. That's why Becky killed them." "This is not revenge," Garen said. "She is simply using his granddaughter's name to justify the massacre that has tarnished her honor." 2 years ago, one of the elders who was the exam administrator was killed. Then, over the course of a year, dozens more experienced craftsmen were killed. And since then, Rebecca Duncan has become known as a serial killer. And now the death of his granddaughter is seen as the reason for the birth of a killer. Her actions did nothing to help Sharon, but only disgraced her name, the old man said. "So today he will clear his granddaughter's name by destroying the killer," Garen said, and reached out his hand to her. "Honor." Becca was angry. His only granddaughter was dead, and he was talking about honor. "It seems they can't understand each other," Garen said, holding her head. He never understood how someone like her could be his granddaughter's friend, Garen asked. Becca replied that she also didn't understand how someone as diligent as Sharon could be related to Garen. The old man grabbed his head. This conversation had degenerated into mutual insults. Becca looked at him, her eyes flashing, and asked why he was talking so much. "Magicians speak with magic. That's what he always told Sharon." Garen exploded with force, many whirlwinds flying from him towards Becca after her words. He gave her a final warning. It was worth mentioning his granddaughter's name again. But Becca interrupted him, saying that Sharon was her closest friend. Garen awakened the wind attribute and summoned a hurricane with a simple wave of his hand. The wind cut the stone and then lifted several boulders into the air. The rocks fell on Becca and crushed her body into a pancake. Of course it was a clone, Garen realized. Becca was just provoking him. All this time he had been dealing with her clone as if she was undergoing training in the Leaf Village. "What an amazing trick!" the old man chuckled and summoned a ball of mana in his hand. He quickly scanned the entire space with it and found Becca. But suddenly she was behind him and held a knife to his throat. Garen was confused. He had to defend himself, but he didn't have time to gather mana. Becca's dagger was faster, and Garen felt his veins tearing and the life leaving his body easily. He couldn't cast the spell anymore, and Becca brushed the blood off the blade. As the old man quickly managed to think, he desperately tried to cover the wound with his hand. Time slowed down. The world turned upside down, the same feeling he had experienced then on the mountain. Feeling like he was on the brink of life and death, Garen fell. When he came to his senses, his whole body shuddered in horror. Becca, who stood in front of him, was disconcerted that it took him longer to get out of her illusion than Riley had before. She got out in a second, but it took him 2. Becca chuckled ominously and asked if the old man had seen his death. Garen was stunned. The sensations were too real. Even though he had broken out of the illusion, he still couldn't help but touch his throat and tell her it was a cheap trick. "Not as cheap as him," Becca laughed. "At least she doesn't start a fight like him." That battle with multiple teams, it was his decision. He wanted to lure her out, Becca realized, and laughed again. Garen must have known that the noise of a big fight would attract her attention, so they deliberately let everyone see the golem's core. The old man answered her that there was no more aggressive magician in the world than she. Becca admitted that she really wanted to go, but Riley stopped her. That's why she didn't come, Garen realized, and he put the end of his staff to her throat. He must go and find her himself, Garen said. He was already getting quite angry with these games. But Becca just clapped her hands right in front of him. She was impressed that he started a fight with everyone just to catch her. "Dozens of people must have died for this," Becca said. "And this man calls her a maniac killer. He is truly full of contradictions," she said, grabbing his staff. Garen was furious. Becca asked him if he saw death, and he admitted that he saw it. It was her death, and now he would bring it into reality. But Becca just smiled sweetly at his words. She felt completely safe. Her mother once told her, Rebecca recalled, 9 out of 10 herb pickers will die in the mountains. The swordsman fights with the sword and will die by the sword. Alchemy dies while testing its elixirs on itself. Magicians die while they follow the path of magicians, such is the law." Rebecca asked to show her the death he had seen. Her mother wished for her to meet an end worthy of a magician before she died. Her 27-year journey as a mage has had its purpose, and she looks forward to what it will show her, Becca said. Her hand reached out and grabbed the magic thread near his face. Meanwhile, Dorothy and Arpel were stunned by Riley's audacity to call them losers. Grim liked Dorothy's reaction to the provocation. It was even better than Becky's. Riley chuckled. Her rival had fallen for such a simple trick. Dorothy was indignant that such a weakling who knew nothing about magic was telling her this. She simply exploded with anger, and her black shadow splashed out towards Riley to destroy her. Coolness, the main virtue of a magician, thought Grim. The magic that is channeled by emotions becomes too obvious. so Riley easily dodges it. Arpel called on the white-haired miss to come to her senses, but she only cursed foully and continued to attack. But her black tentacles kept missing and were simply wasting energy. Arpel couldn't stop Dorothy, so he had to get involved in the battle and attack with plants from above. But these attacks were already too late, and Riley had already seen them before. In addition, the rivals could not catch each other's correct timing and began to argue. Grimm appreciated that the boy had inherited Cromwell's magic. But she hadn't changed at all during the 3 centuries he'd been sleeping, so Arpel would never win like that. Dorothy was already exhausted from using Shadow Shift and receiving a minor wound during Riley's stunt. Both opponents were mentally and physically exhausted, and now the shadows were growing more slowly. The only one who could cause concern was Cromwell's descendant, but they had the advantage over him, and Grimma told Riley to continue. Riley felt threatened. Their attacks became more coordinated and sharper. Time was running out. Even if she got through, Becca could still be in danger, so it was time to make a move. She needed to simultaneously break the connection between the mage and the summoned creature, Grimma said. Riley dodged the powerful blow of the vine again, which moved like a whip. Riley easily jumped up, strengthening herself with magic. The Thieves' Guild member's agility came in handy as she jumped from plant to plant. In the air, the shadows couldn't reach her, and the plants were too slow to react. Riley did the impossible. She saw everything through pathfinding, feeling the space with magic, which negated the effect of limited vision. To break the connection between the mage and the summoned creature, you need to strike directly at the mage, Riley said, and swung her fist. It all ended quickly. Arpel, like most magicians, did not know how to fight in close combat. Dorothy was just hit by the falling plants, so she lay nearby to the side. Riley sighed in relief, and Grimm asked her how she was. Her movements required superhuman concentration in the moment. Grimma knew that she must be very exhausted, too. Olivia's okay, too, he told Riley as she turned to look at the red-haired girl whose whispered prayer came from the bushes. Somehow she managed to survive that battle, Grimma said. A couple of minor wounds, and that's all. Riley found him in the bushes. The golden cat could no longer stand on his feet. His injuries were critical. The plants must have hit him in the heat of battle, Grimma thought. Riley noticed its core sticking out from the cracked hull. When she took it out, the golem went silent. Despite the fact that it could not be called alive, Riley felt regret. Now her task was to help Becky, despite the fact that the battle was not easy, and the matter was not yet over. Riley found it quickly using pathfinding and decided to hurry. But suddenly she felt something that made her worry. Becky's presence was erased, she told Grimma, and she heard footsteps behind her. It was old man Garin from the barber shop in person, still looking stylish despite having just been in a fight. Rebecca Duncan was dead, he said. Their test was over. Becky's presence, so clearly felt just a moment ago, was cut off. Grimm couldn't quite understand it. But it was hard to believe, on the other hand. It was impossible to hide yourself like that. Becky really was dead. If at least one of the team members dies, the test will be completed. Such are the conditions of the test. It's over, Riley thought. No point in being angry, this is reality. Garin asked for his understanding. Rebecca had committed unforgivable crimes and paid for it with her life. Riley asked him if he had lost anyone close to him because of Becca. The old man pompously replied that he had lost something more important: honor. Riley was angry. His words sounded contradictory. He despised those who used competition as a place to kill. However, he used the test to take revenge. He was no different from those he despised in her eyes. Garin replied that he was truly sorry about it, but had nothing more to add. It all made so much sense. Riley became even more angry. Her eyes lit up with fire and she released her power. Old man Garin was stunned and asked if she was already thinking of fighting him. Riley answered yes, and he was even more surprised and asked why if the test was already over for her. Because he killed Becky, Riley answered shortly. Garin couldn't believe that she had become so attached to this killer so quickly and wanted to avenge her. Avenge Becky, why? Riley asked him, not letting up the pressure. Becky's death meant exclusion, and so she was terribly angry about it. She didn't care at all what happened between the two of them. What was much more important was the wasted year. Therefore, Garin also had to lose a year, just like her. Otherwise, she would not be able to live without disappointment. Garin replied that she was indeed an unpleasant person. He acknowledged her abilities. She was no longer a low-ranking mage. You can tell just by looking at the way she dealt with his team. But Riley didn't listen to his boring nonsense any longer and attacked first. Garin said that if that was the case, he simply had no choice. Riley's Rasengan almost reached his face. But the old man was surrounded by a thick shield of mana, which reflected Riley's attack. Then Riley summoned 5 magic bullets at once. Garin told her that she should have realized by now that her attacks couldn't penetrate his thick defense. Grimma agreed with the old man. She lacked firepower. She couldn't do it with her super-precise mana clot. They were in the middle of ruins, so Grimma thought there might be something useful here. He looked at Olivia, who was still sitting in the bushes and whispering prayers. Grimm was outraged. How could one sit in the bushes like a coward? While he and Riley fought with all their might, she never helped them. But then he looked at Olivia again and wondered if she was truly praying out of fear and heard her words sound like ancient runes.